Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee. We have our head coach, Chad Timmerman, with us.
Hi, everybody.
We have our CEO, Nate Pearson.
Hello.
And we have Cannondale and TrainerRoad's Amber Pierce.
Good morning.
And we are going to answer more of the cycling and triathlon related questions that you submitted at trainerroad.com/podcast. And you can do that every week. And every week we will come through all the ones that you submit. So thanks for doing that. It's awesome. It's so great to have so many people sending in those questions all the time. Nate, first things first, a product announcement. We should probably cut straight to that. And then we'll get into some more stuff.
Yeah, cool. A few new cool things. First, we have a new onboarding experience on the website. So if you have somebody that's just starting with TrainerRoad, we've been testing it for a while and it's been really good. Second, we have a new onboarding experience in the desktop app. That's on Windows or Mac. Third, group workout improvements. We have it where there's now a visual indication of who's talking, just like Zoom. Second, you can also choose your first name rather than your username in settings. So it was kind of weird before because you'd be like, Big Legs 23, what's up? Instead of just saying Jonathan. So now you can make it so it says your first name all the time.
To be clear, that is not my username. And I don't even have big legs, so yeah.
That's his TikTok name. And then the next, you can show target of FTP instead of raw watts. So some people requested that. It could either be you don't want to share your FTP, or it's just we're all working just as hard. So see it in % of FTP. And you can also have an option to hide and show cadence and heart rate data. So before we didn't have cadence in there, but you can show both. You can show one or you can show none. So that's really cool. The last one, a lot of people have asked for this for a long time, and we work with Training Peaks and Final Surge to do this, that they can create workouts in Training Peaks or Final Surge, and it will now sync to your TrainerRoad calendar, which is so awesome. So, and then I think you can go back via, if not directly, excuse me, you can go back via Strava or something like, or Garmin Connect as a little hub inside of that. So, sorry, for those that are coached, that's a really cool feature. Lots of people have been using it. So check it out. It's inside of, on the website, you go to your account information and there is a sync button in there, and you can just turn it back on for Training Peaks or enable it for Final Surge. You have to enable something else for Training Peaks for it to work. And there should be a little pop-up telling you that it's a new feature. So those are the new things. If you have any questions, let me know in the chat and I will answer them.
Sweet. And that chat he's talking about is on YouTube. You can join us live on YouTube. It's usually Thursdays at 8 a.m. Pacific, just like it will be next week. And it's fun. We get to interact with all y'all in the chat every once in a while. You might see us like kind of looking over at a screen and typing, and that's usually because what we're doing there is interacting with all of you. So join us on YouTube and check it out. You can subscribe on YouTube. We have new videos that come out every single day, whether it's instructional videos, whether it's videos that are cut up sections of this podcast or race analysis, plenty of different stuff. So subscribe on that, and subscribe to the podcast if you're listening to it as well, so you don't miss an episode. One quick thing, I've gotten a handful of questions after watching the live ramp test video that we did a couple of weeks ago about seeing your live FTP and how to enable that. So firstly, that's a feature that's enabled on desktop apps only, or I should say Windows and Mac apps right now. And it's coming eventually to our mobile apps. That's the plan. But right now it's just on Windows and Mac. And you can just go ahead, Nate.
I want to say something on that. So we have a much larger mobile update coming, and it's baked into that. So that's what we are waiting for.
Correct. Yep. So if you're wondering where it is, it's over on the desktop app, so you can try it out that way. The Successful Athletes podcast, it's a new podcast by us, and everybody should subscribe to it. We'll have a link down in the description below for this podcast and a link in this YouTube video so that you can check it out. It's awesome. We're interviewing successful athletes to find out how we can become faster. So we just dissect specific performances that they've done or specific things or accomplishments that they've done, and we find the measurable, actionable things that they've done so then we can improve on them. It's pretty cool. Last week, we had one, or I should say this week, with Megan Hakkinen. She's a 24-hour TT world champ, uses TrainerRoad, pretty exciting stuff. We have another one. We have, many more coming up here. We have some coming up with triathletes, with people one person that Everested on Everest, which is insane. And then he also Everested at low elevation. So we dissect both of those, one at 16,500 feet, one at sea level, to see how different it was and the different preparation and techniques for that. Tons of different ones. Even one where we're going to be talking about Cape Epic in particular and talking about how to race as a team. I saw Amber's ears perk up there. So it's super exciting stuff. Nate, you want to? Nate just looks nervous.
They just need a lot of help. So no, just kidding. Actually, just little small update on that. I don't know if it's a further doc, but Brandon is getting good at descending. And Amber's power is crazy. I don't think everyone's seen her last ramp test, but she went from 3.3 watts per kilo to 4 watts per kilo in one 4-week block.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe my new target is Chad and Pete. Chad, how's your fitness?
Haven't really started addressing it formally yet, but I have gone on a couple rides.
That's what I like to hear, buddy.
I've only got 9 months. I'm pretty sure I can conjure a few more watts, but I'm actually riding pretty well, so I at least have that working for me.
The slow start with a throat clear is always a great way to come in strong on a question right there. That was did not give me confidence.
I'm not worried. Not at all.
Nice. Sophia and I are also not worried. We're having some special meetings that are secret, and we're not letting anyone know because we have we're doing every advantage we can take, and we'll write these down and talk about them after the race happens.
Ooh, look at that.
For who? You and Pete, or Amber and Brandon, or everybody. Overall?
Everybody. Wow.
All of us.
Look at that.
Amber and Brandon are going to be tough.
There's no clear, easy victor here. I'll say that.
No, I agree. I don't know. Chad and Pete have me a little bit worried. I'm not going to lie.
I like Nate. I think you dropped a dad joke there, and I'm going to leave it at that for eagle-eyed listeners or eagle-eared listeners, if that's even a thing, to go back and listen to that for what you just said. So it's a sneaky one that actually is a hint at something. So I don't even know if you realized you made it. One quick thing too, I want to clarify for the Successful Athletes podcast, a clarification on what we're looking for, and soon, well, I should say not soon, but we're working on having a separate site set up so that you can submit your story specifically for the Successful Athletes podcast, kind of like how you submit questions right now. But just to give you an idea of what we're looking for to kind of help you through, we're really trying to focus on discussions of how people use TrainerRoad to train and then how they execute on their big day, whatever that big day is, or whatever the long process was. And we're looking for actionable takeaways, right? And like discussions on specific things that they use to get faster. Particularly TrainerRoad. If you've used TrainerRoad to get faster, we want to know how you used it to accomplish, whether that's winning a race, whether it's PR, whether it's losing weight, whether it's doing anything, whatever it may be. Like Cam Summerson's story, getting in good enough shape to be able to donate a kidney to keep his son alive. Talk about a really powerful one. So
that was an amazing story. Just amazing.
Yeah, what an incredible dad, huh? Like, it's just so cool to listen to that episode. Super motivating. And then, and if you feel like you match that criteria and you want to share your story to motivate others and to help them, let me know. And for now, just send an email to jonathan@trainerroad.com. And we can go from there. If you're listening to this in the past, chances are there's a new model on how to submit those. So listen to another episode, a feature episode, and you'll figure it out. Okay, let's just jump straight into Meg's question. So she says, I was progressing nicely for months until recently when I not only hit a plateau, but I wasn't able to complete workouts. Super frustrating, and I'm not sure what's going on. My muscles feel so tired and tight at anything sweet spot and above. And she says, I often have to decrease to 90 to 95%. For a background, I ride 4 to 5 times a week on a plan using Plan Builder. That's our automated training plan builder. And some outside when the weather is nice, but mostly inside. I'm a 43-year-old female triathlete, but I'm only biking right now. I'm 147 pounds at a 165 FTP. So we went into Meg's career to check things out on TrainerRoad, but we have some general guidance and also some specific guidance for Meg as well. Chad, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So, Meg, when it comes to plateaus, they typically mean one of two things. You either need more stress or you need more rest. And I say usually because there's actually a third thing, and we'll get to that. In terms of more stress, first off, a time budget will eventually limit performance improvement. So if you only have 4 hours a week to train versus 6 or 8 or whatever, you're eventually going to come up against a plateau that you can't push past simply because you can't dedicate more time to training. That's real. But there are things you can do along the way before you hit that limit. And in particular, that's changing the training in one way or another. So all we're looking for here is a new or an unusual stimulus, something to which your body has not adapted yet, not gotten used to. Because when you think of that adaptive process, it seeks homeostasis. I mean, that is the goal of our body at all times, excuse me, is to, if it basically push us to plateaus, push us to a point where we can accommodate the stress that we're inflicting on it. So we get good at it eventually. So if we don't change the stress, then we basically get good at it, and then we just kind of ride that plateau for as long as we decide to. With that said, when it comes to challenging that whole adaptive process, don't get too varied. And I actually learned this the hard way back when I trained endurance athletes on the strength side of things. We did circuit training classes, and I typically rotated the assortment of exercises on a 4 or 5, maybe 6 week basis. And then for whatever reason, I got it in my head that I was going to rotate it on a weekly basis. So people would come in, they would just start to learn the exercises, start to get good at it, start to develop the neuromuscular patterning, start to understand how hard this movement's going to feel, how to move. And then I would basically yank the rug out from under their feet and give them a whole new set of exercises. It was not popular. So it didn't last long, and it didn't make sense anyway. So even if I really liked the format, even if they liked it, they probably weren't going to benefit from it as much as they would sticking with the same thing for a longer length of time and developing that consistency.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that I want to just stress the point that the type of stress really matters here. So when, someone's just getting into riding, for example, and they haven't ridden much, just doing something when you were doing nothing can give you huge gains. And those initial gains will kind of taper off, though, as your body gets used to that load. And so the longer and more experience you have riding, the more your body is going to need specificity and higher quality of training to get those adaptations. So I'm a really good example of this. I've been riding for a really long time. So the longer I got into my career, like initially when I first started bike riding, just going out for rides gave me huge bumps. And even after this past break, I took a lot of time off just going out and riding and not worrying about the quality or the focus or what type of systems I was stressing. I got some nice gains, but that for my body's really, really used to riding. So I have to do really, quality structure to get those gains anymore. And so this was one of the things I wanted to look at, just looking at your training history. And you do have a really consistent and long history of riding too. So to me, that says that it's not just about riding, but it's a lot about making sure that you're focusing on the quality of the riding and making sure, so not just the quantity, right? Just because you've been really consistent in getting on your bike, since you've been doing that for a long time, your body's adapted to that. So now it's about making sure that the time on the bike is really high quality. And I think that that's one of the big things that we're looking at here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess when Chad, going back to, I guess on the lower side of stress, if less stress is the issue.
Yep. Yeah. So in the interest of keeping things really simple, which unfortunately that's not how it works, if we could just increase stress or increase rest, let's look at that side of things, the restful side of things. So, which could be stated just as more recovery. I hesitate to put it in terms of recovery though, because we're just talking, it might just be a reduction in stress, and that makes the more in this context really, really relative to what the athlete can accommodate. So we can have a seasoned veteran rider who's accustomed to doing 800 plus TSS weeks, something that's just not even within the mental grasp of most of us. We don't train that much. We don't train that hard. And there are people who do that consistently. I mean, they're used to it. So what that rider is going to do when it comes to reducing the stress could be what another rider does in terms of their highest TSS weeks. So this rider could cut it back to 400 or 500 when some of us are working an entire season to get to that 400 or 500 TSS point. So that's one thing to consider. Both your basically your training history. And then you also have to consider how overreach did you allow yourself to get? What might have inspired this plateau? If in fact it's because you're fatigued, how far did you push it before you recognize that I need to pull the reins? I've gone a little too far. I need to figure out how to dial it back such that I can get on top of things again. Because you can dig that hole pretty deep, which means it takes a lot longer to dig yourself out of that hole, to fill that hole back in. And then you also have to consider your level of recoverability. So, I as a 48-year-old athlete, I know for sure if I tried the same training loads I tried in years past or decades past, I would not recover as well as I did when I was 38. Certainly not when I was 28 or 18. So age is one aspect of it, but there are a lot of other things that can affect that level of recoverability. And I'll touch on those in a minute here.
Chad, would you say that recoverability as a 48-year-old might affect you in the middle of something like a 7 or 8 day mountain bike stage race in South Africa?
Remains to be seen. I'm hopeful though, so don't try to get in my head. You're not even racing.
Sorry, Chad. I just enjoy poking the bear.
Whose side are you on?
He's literally on my payroll, so he's on my. And he knows Sophia. He's voted for us already.
I'm a paid man, and I fear Sophia as well. So yeah.
Fair enough. I can't hold that against you.
Sorry, Chad.
Okay, so back to what put you in this hole. What led to this plateau? And there are a number of reasons that number of reasons out there. So is it the end of the season, or is it something along the lines of a necessary? Is it the end of the season? In which case, you're looking at a necessary long-term break, a legitimate break. So 2 weeks. I like 2 weeks off. Some athletes take up to a month off before they hit it again. Amber's one of those athletes who can take a month off and actually rekindle that fitness pretty rapidly. But what if it's something that's more long-term though, something you want to add and sustain, like adding strength training to your routine? There might be a period of fatigue where you're going to have to adjust to that additional stressor and figure out how to weave it into everything else you're already doing. There are situations where in these pandemic times, you just have a ton of extra time and you really go for it. This is probably a temporary addition. So it might be a lesser plateau, and you can work past it simply by reducing volume and recognizing I escalated things too quickly. And then, maybe you're just verging on a recovery week, in which case it's not really a plateau. It's more fatigue. I don't think that's what Meg's talking about here, but that is something to keep in mind. So my advice is really pretty simple. First off, when in doubt, just take 2 days completely off, because more times than not, a couple days of complete rest, and I'm talking complete rest. Don't go out and dig holes in the yard. Don't do any home projects that are physically stressful. Take a couple days completely off, because more times than not, this will right that ship and it will put you back in line. I did it the other day or the other week, and it worked wonders. But this assumes that there have been no other obvious missteps along the way. You're not just coming off of a training camp. You haven't just excessively increased your TSS or escalated your ramp rate too quickly. You're not making a too rapid re-entry into training. Maybe you've taken a break, maybe you're off the couch, maybe you're just a little less active, but you're jumping right back in where you left off. That can push you to a quicker than usual plateau. You can't be facing an impending illness or injury, and you can't be returning from one either. These are both things that can influence how quickly you top out. And then, as always, any significant emotional events are going to influence your fatigue levels. And it may not even be an actual plateau so much as a limitation due to other things that are being inflicted on you at the time. Think of things like moving, changing locations, moving into a new house. This is a big one, and people underplay its severity. Divorce, or really the end of any relationship, and then a loss of a loved one, loss of a pet, anything like that. I mean, these are things that maybe you don't recognize are going to take a big toll on your physical capabilities, but they absolutely do. So it might not be a plateau. Pandemic. It might just be absolutely. That's yes, that's another one. There are all these things that again, we don't give due credit. We just accept that, this is something that's common. This is something I've done a few times, but we don't recognize that in addition to all the physical stress we're inflicting on our bodies, this carries a pretty weighty toll.
One thing I do want to jump in and mention here before we move on is that when we were looking at Meg's training in particular, she mentioned sweet spot. So I was looking at some of the sweet spot workouts, and I want to use this as an example because I think this is something that other people can learn from too. So when you're training any of the energy systems, whether it's VO2 or sweet spot, but we'll take sweet spot as the example, there is a progression to it, right? So if you have done a week of really consistent sweet spot work, you've been stressing that system, you're adapting in that system, and then you do a week of maybe unstructured rides, go back and look at, it means that that progression, like you've lost a little bit of that progression. So one of the things you can do is you can go back and look in your training analytics, look at your time and zones. And if you're doing an unstructured outdoor ride, you might be surprised at how little time you actually spend in sweet spot zone. And then even if you've spent chunks of time in sweet spot zone, you may not be stressing that zone for 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes at a time, which is a really different way of stressing that zone than just sneaking into it for a few minutes at a time over the course of a couple of hours. So that's another thing to consider. If it's sweet spot and above, that's really the thing that you feel like you're hitting a ceiling with right now. It might be because you haven't been progressing it in you haven't it hasn't been a progressive advance in that energy system. So it's tough to jump back into anything sweet spot and above if you haven't been training it consistently. So that's kind of stepping back to that quality versus quantity and the type of stress. And again, going back to what Chad said, everything, more stress versus less stress. I think that's a really, really good way of looking at it. And I totally agree that if you're in doubt, just take some time off. There's very little downside risk to that.
To expand on what Meg said, or what Amber said about Meg, absolutely the progressions. I looked and you jumped ahead. So what happens, like you normally do, depending on the phase, you might go 10 minutes, 12, 15, 20, and then 30. And that's the progression through sweet spots to be able to do those. And if you skip a week or you replace one ride with an outside ride that doesn't have sustained, like unstructured, doesn't have sustained sweet spot, and you try to jump from 10 and you skip a few and you go to 20 or 30, it is darn near the hardest workout you'll ever do. But then if you actually get through each one, it's like an 8 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 each time. And it's an easier progression through it. So if you do miss one of those, it's perfectly fine to like delete the workout for that week and just drag the workout from last week or copy it over so that you like step back in the progression. And honestly, overall, it's not going to make a huge difference in your fitness, but it does get you success and you get through those intervals and you'll be set up better in the future. So Amber, that's what you would do, right?
Totally. Or take the workout outside. So you want to be outside, do the sweet spot efforts outside. The next time you go out to do a ride, you can still make it a really fun ride. I find it really fun to do structure outside sometimes because it's just, I really enjoy it, but you can stress those systems even when you're riding outside too. So that's another option as well. Like if you just need an unstructured day for like a mental break, that's a whole different story, but just know that, you may need to adjust a little bit when you jump back into progressing your training.
Yeah. And when you do it outside too, it's especially for sweet spot, it's going to be very like dependent on where you live in the world. Because sometimes having a 10 or even 20 minutes, even in Reno where we have long climbs, if I have to do a 20-minute interval, I have to go to a very specific spot to do it. And 30 is even harder. There's just a couple climbs or something that we could do that in. And you can do those, John, outside workouts on your Garmin or Wahoo head unit, right?
Heck yeah,
John's
man.
been doing 100% of his training that way.
Yeah, 100% of it. It's been, it's been a really cool experiment to learn a lot of different things. In some cases, it's like been really interesting. Like I've thought, I've now to the point where I'm like, this is a good workout to do on my mountain bike. This is a good one to do on my road bike. The main difference there is gearing, right? And I know that what like my constraints are for the terrain I'll be riding, and then I just think about what I need to do for the intervals, and I match them, and it's just awesome. It's like one thing to share on this is, as a result of doing all of my workouts outside, which it's super easy on your TrainerRoad calendar, you just switch them over to be outside workouts, and then it just shows up on your head unit. And like with Garmin, it's really nice because it just said, like, as soon as you turn your head unit on, it says, this is your workout today, TLAC +1 or whatever it might be. And you just hit the check mark and then you start it. And it's that easy. It's super cool. And actually to share like some little pro tips on that, on things that have helped me with outside workouts recently. So firstly, with Garmin's at least, what you can do is you can always swipe over to stepping back, we have a custom workout screen that you can make that is super good. And it's a lot like TrainerRoad, and you'll never find yourself needing to swipe over to view different data fields, anything like that. It's got it all in one place, and you can check that out. It's on our blog. It's on the TrainerRoad Help Center, and we'll make sure that we put a link in the forum for this episode, which is 264, and you'll be able to go in and find that link and see the custom screen. But let's just say that you have a question like yesterday or 2 days ago when I was in the middle of my 8-minute VO2 50/40s that I was doing, and I was losing count, and I didn't know if I was at 37 intervals or if I was at one interval halfway through. I was able to, you can swipe back over to the workout screen and then just swipe up. And it actually shows you the full workout, and it shows you highlighted in blue or whatever color you've selected. It shows you how far through that workout you are. It's a super handy little tool. And in that same spot, let's just say that you start an interval and then for some reason you have to slow down, whether it was because of traffic, whether it was because of some sort of obstacle. You can always just restart your interval because right there's a button that says restart step. It's really handy. It's been fantastic, and it's been a great way for me to get in something that I like to do when I train inside as well, which when I train inside, I'll do my workout, and if I have time, I love using the extend cooldown feature and throwing on some time at, whether it's endurance pace or tempo after a workout. I love doing that for 30 minutes or so. And I've been able to plan my routes to be able to do that too. But the perks, I've been doing all the work training on my mountain bike, which has been really helpful. And I just feel right at home. And that's the bike that I care about most in terms of racing. So that's a really good thing. Number two, I've been able to get used to the heat and do well with the heat, relatively speaking, which is also a very good thing. Not that we have races going on right now that are going to be in the heat, but still, it's a good thing to have for sure. So it's just awesome. It's a super fun experience, and to be able to do my training inside and outside, I love it. So
I have one more thing on this list.
Yeah.
And this is, you've heard me harp about this, but you look in the forum too, like people got to jump on the bandwagon. 3 hours before the ride, 3 to 4, check your diet and nutrition and your carb intake if you're doing sustained sweet spot. You don't have to have it, but boy, does it make it easier to be able to do that. And two, if you have that hypoglycemic thing and you try to eat an hour or 2 hours before, I just had it like last week. I was like, literally my legs were shaking on the bike after the warm up, which is weird. And that's a small percentage of athletes, but just if you have that kind of thing, be aware of the timing, very specific. But having that big carb meal, the best days that I do it is I wake up and I have like oatmeal, and then at lunch, I'll have some kind of plant-based fibrous carbs. And then 3 to 4 hours later, I do my workout, and that gets me pretty loaded. And it's hard, but not impossible. Where if I don't do that, it can feel impossible.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue into the final point, because I mentioned that plateaus are more times than not, it's either you need more stress or you need more rest. Usually, that the other thing that enters into that is the fueling, especially when it comes to stuff like sweet spot and stuff where you're working close to threshold, maybe even, close to threshold, either above or below it. And you need to maintain a high level of basically sugar. You got to keep driving the activity with sugar. So if you're low on sugar, this is a huge issue. So fueling is that third thing, that if it's not more stress, if it's not more rest, then definitely look at your fueling, and probably you should look at your fueling first. This is an opportunity to talk about something that I've wanted to talk about a number of times, and we have talked about, but I'd like to elaborate on it in different ways. And it's just seeing your fueling or seeing poor fueling or inadequate fueling as what it actually is, which is energy deficiency. I've in the past termed it malnutrition, because it basically is. Your body has limited resources. You only have so much energy to dedicate to the tasks at hand. And your brain's really good at recognizing threats to the body's safety and putting the brakes on what you can do. So if you're not giving your body enough fuel and you're forcing it to do workouts, it's going to come at the expense of something else. Something else is going to pay for it. And this is what this energy deficiency basically boils down to. And this is a topic I definitely want to flesh out far more than this right here. I don't just want to touch on it. I want to talk about it. And I think in the context of everything else we're going to cover today, this is not a good topic to cover now, but do expect us to talk about it in the very near future.
Yeah.
Oh, and then,
big one.
Sorry, to close it out, this is another point, either more stress or more rest or maybe nutrition. This brings me to the final point, which is typically not just one thing. And it seems like it should be kind of binary in terms of more stress or more rest, but actually it might not be. It might be more stress with more rest. It might be more stress with better nutrition. It might be more rest with better nutrition. I mean, it's almost never just one thing. It's almost always multifactorial.
Amber, have you ever overtrained in your career? And if so, what did you do to fix it? And how long did it take to get out of that hole? You're laughing like it's like, oh yeah, all the time.
Oh yeah. No, I probably went through a few different periods of overtraining. And the first one was, I think it was my second year of racing. I was racing with Webcore, and we'd just done like a big block of back-to-back stage races. And then I started the Tour of Montreal, and I couldn't, like, it was the weirdest, it was the first time I'd ever encountered this, but it was that just, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't put out the power. You hit the gas and there's just nothing there. And my teammate, that team was amazing, and that they were like, this is what's happening to you. You're overextended, just stop. And they pulled me from the race the next day, and I sat around and I watched my teammates race for the rest of the race, helped feed bottles and things like that. And then I felt kind of down on myself about it, but they were really supportive and said, no, this is what happens. And if you don't do something about it this second, it's going to continue to get worse. And then of course I didn't totally learn my lesson on the first time around. Later in my career, I did get really overtrained again when I was racing in Europe. And that was really brutal. I think I was probably overtrained for at least it started tipping that way. From the time it started tipping that way to the point at which I realized what was happening was probably a couple of years, actually. And it took me more than a couple of years to feel like I was fully recovered from that. And it did require just a lot of rest and a lot of patience and just reframing a lot of things, like reframing my own expectations of my body, reframing, how I was judging and critiquing myself and my efforts. And it's pretty miserable. So it's one of those things, like, if you can nip it in the bud, you're so much better off.
And Amber, let me ask you, how important is team culture in that? Because the more writer biographies or autobiographies that I read, the more I see that some teams, both the coaching staff and the support staff and the fellow writers, are very accepting of the fact that you're overreaching, you need to back off, and some completely shun their teammates in these cases.
Exactly.
and almost ignore them and pretend like they don't matter suddenly.
Yeah, it was a pretty stark contrast between the two. So the first experience early on with WebCore, they recognized it right away. There was no judgment. It was like, this is a normal thing that does happen. You have to go through it to learn how to handle it. And there was, it was very positive. It was just like, okay, let's stop so that you don't, this doesn't end up being a season ending situation. And it didn't. Like, I took a week off, just some good rest, and came back, and I ended up coming back really, really strong after that because I got the adequate recovery. But that was a cultural thing that made it, I had the support to do that. And then later, I want to say, it ends up being a constellation of different things within a team culture, right? Because there's, looking at the athlete as a person, there's, okay, we are willing or we're not willing to shuffle around the roster for the next few races. There's fueling. So in my case, fueling was a huge part of that kind of second decline over a couple of years. And that had to do with team culture too. So having a culture where, eating less and less, people are going to encourage that or reward it in some way that you end up with that energy deficiency that you're talking about. And then there's a huge difference between, really positive pressure in an environment like that, where you have a lot of support and people are excited to chase great results. And then there's, the flip side of the same coin, which can end up being a very kind of toxic environment of, intra-team competitiveness. And so all of those things, can combine to either nudge you towards kind of a healthier approach or nudge you towards a more toxic approach. And certainly all of those things combined in the second instance in my career. And that was tough, but it was, I will say I did learn my lesson the second time around.
For the second time around, when you were eating less, was that chasing weight goals or body composition?
Yeah. Man, and I've talked about this a lot, but I just, I'm tall and I don't fit the stereotypical cyclist body that people, expect or stereotype. And that really, that was a big hurdle for me mentally, because it just felt like I didn't feel like I looked like an athlete. I didn't feel like I looked like a professional cyclist. And it bothered me to imagine that when other people looked at me, that they wouldn't instantly say, oh, she must be a pro cyclist, which is a silly thing because I was a pro cyclist. So by definition, my body is defining what a pro cyclist body is. Which is, it's just funny to think about in retrospect, because now I feel like I have much more clarity on the situation. But at the time, it was really hard because, again, you're just steeped in this culture where either you're being encouraged to eat less or, you're being encouraged to actually eat and fuel yourself adequately. And that was a really big one. So I was restricting calories because I felt really self-conscious about how tall I was, how big I looked on the stage when we would do team presentation before the race. And I was not in an environment where there was enough counteracting those thoughts to pull me out of it. And it just ended up being this kind of self-perpetuating spiral that, it was, I felt really terrible. And I mean, feel terrible, it's not just on the bike. It starts to seep into every aspect of your life. And it's a huge drain on your well-being just in general. So I really don't recommend that.
Wait, so when you got, you said it took a couple years. Does that means it took a couple years to change your eating and your fueling, or you changed your eating and your fueling and then it still took a couple years to get back?
Changed the eating and the fueling, and it still took a couple years to get back. Like, I had to be really, really conscientious about making sure I was recovering adequately. Anytime I felt like I was starting to overreach a little bit too much, stepping back, making sure that I was being really careful about fueling every workout really well. And that's one of the things, everybody who's listened to this podcast has heard me harp on this, but I really think it's important to just build those good habits. And so I've just made it a point to, I make it a habit to fuel every single workout. Like, even if I'm doing a recovery ride, anybody who's done group workouts with me, you always see like I have some constant supply of carbohydrate. And for me, it's just, I want to continue to cultivate that as a habit, because when I eat more during the ride, I feel better. When I feel better, I perform better. When I perform better, I feel better. And it just creates this positive cycle. And so it was just trying to keep that positive cycle going was a big part of it. But there's the behavioral change, but then there's allowing your body to actually heal. And the healing component of it took a really long time.
And also consider how easy it is for you to undernourish when, say you're a rider of my size who has a basal metabolic rate around 2,500 calories. And then I do a workout or two over the course of a day that burns another 1,500. So I'm looking at a 4,000 calorie expenditure, and it's really easy for me to just get by on 3,500 calories that day. I mean, in the long term, it doesn't really play out, but for me to sell myself just a bit short, bank those 500 calories and think I'm going to lose a little bit of fat because of that, and then do that the next day and the next day and the next day. And it perpetuates itself, and it eventually starts working against you because, again, you're malnourishing yourself. That there's a balance that cannot be maintained. It's not a balance.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And for those who, I'm sure some people don't know your height, could you share your height? And then what is like a healthy racing weight for you? Because I think it's also important for our female athletes to hear that you don't have to be 110 pounds to like destroy me and Chad and everybody.
Yeah. So I'm 5'10", so I'm relatively tall in the peloton, and I'm, anywhere between 150 to 155 pounds is sort of like a healthy weight for me. And that was usually where I raced my best, honestly. It's easy to look at, watts per kg and just start doing the math on if you just decrease the kg part of that a little bit and just watching how those numbers change. It's really easy to kind of trick yourself into thinking like, oh, that would be an easy way to, change my watts per kg. But really, like, there's so many other factors that go into performance, and feeling good and just having a general baseline of good well-being I cannot overstate the importance of that. And that was, my body felt good there. Like, in that space, I felt really powerful. I got results. I won bike races. I didn't get sick. When I finally got back on track and was fueling myself well, I just stopped getting sick. It was amazing. Even racing at the professional level, where we talk about, having to walk this razor's edge with your immune system, my body just was so much more robust and resilient in a way that, I could feel, I felt like I could move more confidently in my body, which is no small thing. There's so many ways of articulating this, because it's mental, it's physical, it's emotional. It really gets to the core of your being in a lot of ways. But yeah, we tend to think of riders, professional cyclists, as being shorter, petite, super skinny. But really, you can be a really strong cyclist and chase excellence and chase gains at any height and any weight, any shape, any size. It's just about figuring out what works for you. And it's about walking your own path and getting better at the thing that you want to get better at.
One thing please go ahead. I'll jump in last.
I was just going to say my single best season, I managed to whittle myself down to 168 pounds, which is a 6'2" guy who had a bit of upper body mass. I didn't look good, but the numbers were there. My watts per kilogram were stellar. I actually touched 5 watts a kilogram, and I thought, oh, this is where I need to reside. And then without really paying attention to it, I crept back up to 175 pounds. but my performance improved all the way. And then I settled at that 175 and raced really well at that 175 for the next 2.5, 3 seasons. So even unbeknownst to me, the numbers weren't there, but the performance absolutely was, because my body had found that sweet spot. It had found where it needs to be able to perform at its best.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I was going to ask you, Amber, is when you stopped focusing on the KJ side of it, did you actually increase the watt side so your ratio got better?
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing. And again, this is one of my mantras that I repeat over and over, is chase the performance. So it's, for most people, I would suggest if you're looking at that equation of watts per, kilogram, chase the watts, build your engine, because you can gain so much more from that. And your body will settle into, if you're fueling appropriately, if you're nourishing yourself, if you're not putting yourself in that energy deficient zone, your body will adapt. That's just what our bodies do. Our bodies are like, oh, this is what's happening in the world. These are the things we need to be able to do. Your body will find a really good way of optimizing all of the systems, whether it's your sweet spot system, your threshold system, your VO2 system. It will optimize those things, and your weight and your body shape will be one of those. But it's one of those things where we kind of think like, oh, I have to control every piece of this. No, just chase the performance and let your body do the rest. And that's where, when you have those big, strong engines, that's how you win races. And again, that's the sustainable way of looking at it, right? Then a huge part of having a successful career is not avoiding injury and illness at inopportune times, right? And if you have a resilient, robust body, a resilient, robust system, if you feel good, if you have good well-being, all of those things will play into being able to get results, and being able to get results consistently and do that year over year and season over season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have 2 things and then I'm done. Amber, first, you should probably taper right now for Cape Epic so you don't overtrain. And 2, for everyone that doesn't follow our weird system, she's 178 centimeters and 70 kilograms around that. Right. You're actually bigger than John, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah, which is okay. And then she's like,
no judgment.
I mean, for a female, relative, you're a much higher level than John.
Yes.
For performance,
yeah, for sure.
Right, for male to female, which is awesome. And I think that's just something to get in your people's brains, because cyclists, we get stuck on like, as you said, a whole bunch of KJs.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add to this that hammers home the point that Chad made, and also that you were making as well, Amber, is that I think us cyclists have just athletes in general, have a hard time letting go of peak numbers in the past. And we think that we need to constantly stay at those numbers, but our bodies change over the years. Even as a professional athlete, I assume, Amber, you probably still, let's just assume that you were fueling the work properly and it was managed properly from start to finish. You probably still wouldn't be the same athlete with the same threshold, with the same weight in the beginning as you would have been at the end of your career. It changes. Right. And that's something that I think is really important to respect. Like Chad for Cape Epic, he isn't going to try to get down to 168 pounds because it's just not something that, even though he achieved it once, that doesn't mean that it's the best way forward at this point. And that may also go the other direction too. Something may happen in your life where you end up being lighter and something changes in that regard. Like the point is, like Amber said with the mantra of chase performance, like that's what you're going for. Don't try to become something that you once were and hold on to that and hope that you're going to recreate the exact results that it happened then. Your body's changed. You've changed. Maybe your goals have changed. So
and to further that, I had reached that mythical, in my personal holy grail of 5 watts a kilogram, and then what I didn't realize is that I raced better at 4.5 watts a kilogram. I had better performance, better outcomes, more podium finishes at a less favorable strength to weight ratio.
Yeah, that's really going to depend on the type of racing you're doing too. If it was a hill climb, Chad would probably do that. But for crits and the stuff that Chad was just destroying, you probably
even road races, climbing road races, even
better sustained power, better sprints, better reactions, better bridging than being super duper light. And that happens too. I beat in it, like I think I was at 3.8 watts per kilo, and I beat 5 watts per kilo people in a crit, which it feels really good. But it's just part of its strategy too. But I'm just saying, like, raw watts on a flat course are underrated. Totally. They're totally good
for sure.
Yeah, I think the point, it's like meet yourself where you are, let go of ideas about what you think you should look like, do, be, whatever, and approach it again with curiosity. let's see what happens when I actually train consistently for 6 months. Let's see what happens. Let's see what I can do. Let's see how my body can handle this. And then it's a learning process, and you're not constantly comparing yourself against some imagined ideal, which may or may not be what's actually the best thing for you.
Focus on the process, not the outcome. I just did an Instagram video on this for business. tr.nate. Follow me. I'm like, I've been stuck at like 8,000 for a long time. So please follow. I gotta get to 10K, so I do links.
It's a fun follow if you follow Nate. I can attest to that. So follow us all on there. Even Chad has an Instagram. He may or may not use it, but he's on there. So
he looks surprised when you said that. He was like, I do.
Yeah.
He's going to get like 20,000 followers and not even know it.
I know.
And not a single post.
Yeah. The account's there. That's the important thing. The account's there. So let's go into Reese's question. Reese says, I've been following the low volume climbing road race plan for my A event. Obviously, this is now canceled, but as I was getting great results from the training with little or no outdoor riding, I decided to stick with it. And really, I guess what he's saying there, we should sub in outdoor riding with structure or like unstructured rides, right? Like that's like the key thing there. So, of course, when you stick with structure inside or out, you get faster. That's what happens, right? So he says, I decided to stick with it. And this isn't something I've done with great discipline in the past, but the progress and gains were really motivating. The low volume plan is the most I could really do and means about 4-ish hours of training and riding a week. Not a huge amount of TSS as a result, but enough to keep my FTP on an upward curve and respectable level of fitness. He mentions that his FTP went up to 262 and he's at 75 kilograms. So that's another really good example of the fact, kind of like what you were talking about early on, Chad. Some athletes, they don't bat an eye at 800 TSS. For others, it's all relative to the athlete. 200 TSS might be something that's really tough for you to achieve, and you work your way steadily up. That's the key, right? To where you find a sustainable level, and then that's where you will reside. So he says, however, the event in question was a bit of a brute. 220 kilometers of riding and 3,500 meters or so of climbing. It's called the Dragon Ride in South Wales. And he says, which probably would have meant a 9-hour day or more in the saddle for me. Recently, it's dawned on me that there was a massive deficit or difference between my weekly TSS and the TSS of the event, as well as how long I am conditioned to sit in the saddle. So he actually estimated the TSS, since it was going to be a 9-hour ride, at 900 TSS. And if you could do that, that would be your FTP is way wrong, or you are superhuman and we need to study you. Because 100 TSS for an hour means that you just rode at threshold for an hour. So if you can do that for 9 hours, you would be breaking the laws of threshold and many other things as well. So
The laws of threshold.
Yeah. So, but granted, what he's talking about is the big bump. And you can see this if you use TrainerRoad and you're looking at your training plan, and then you have like a race like Leadville, or a race like anything, like any sort of long, big event. And if that's in your calendar and you've been doing low volume training, it'll look like, whoa, big spike on race day. That's what he's talking about. So he says, how could I have overcome this deficit? Or more to the point, does it even matter? Was I overreaching with my goal event and just setting myself up for an absolute shoeing come the event? So he also says a couple more details on this. I've listened to recent podcasts about the perils of adding in extra volume, but I did it anyway because of this deficit. I love that. It's been quite pleasing to see the training benefits in the real world, but it left me unable to complete all of the VO2 sessions when I've come back to the plan. The reason why is relatively obvious in terms of self-prescribed extra TSS, but if I couldn't cope with this to top up, I can't help but think I would have been massively underprepared for my event. Let's assume there's no other external forces at work. I'm sleeping well and eating well. Well, firstly, that's like a huge assumption, right? Assuming that there are no other things affecting it. And this totally speaks to Chad's point when he said, likely there is not only one cause for any issue that we bump up against as an athlete. It's almost always many factors that are factoring into causing where we're at. So whether that be positive or negative. But we always love simplifying it down to one thing. When we have that great day, it's totally because we just bought that, $2,000 wheel set because we want to feel good about buying it. Or, it's for one reason or another. Maybe that ice cream actually was good is the common one that we always tell ourselves, right? So chances are there are a lot of different things. But so this is actually a question that I've gotten quite a few times when people have they've sent just on Instagram, they reach out to me and they go, whoa, look at this. I'm doing Leadville and I'm doing a low volume plan, and look at how big the TSS differential is on race week, right? But I think maybe one of the most important things that people should understand is the fact that not all TSS is created equal. So let's like flip this on its head, right? Let's say you're doing 850 TSS a week, and that's in really low intensity work. So you are not breaking Z2, and you are just staying at Z2, and you're doing that all week. If you show up to go do a criterium, and that criterium is 45 minutes, and it is on the gas, and you do 45 TSS, you won't be prepared for that 45 TSS, right? Even if you've done just 800 TSS at zone 2 the whole time, and then you have to show up and deal with constant punches way over threshold and repeated efforts, it's going to be tough. So using just TSS to see if you are prepared for an event, it breaks down in the sense that not all TSS is created equal. And we always talk about this, but we train energy systems. We don't just train basic overall numbers to get you to a specific point. And that's something that's, I think, really, Nate, you showed that at Leadville, right? In the sense that you didn't go out and do a bunch of 9-hour rides. I did the same thing. I didn't go out and do a bunch of 9-hour rides, but you still did well.
Yeah. I just did 2-hour sweet spot rides. And part of it, and I'm not saying I probably could have done better if I would have done some like 5-hour outside rides that I could actually recover from, not 9 hours because I can't recover from those, and built up to that. But part of it was just to say, like, there's so much, at least back then too, talk of like, you can't do it this way. It's impossible. And I wanted to be like, no, you can do it this way. And I did it.
Yeah.
So there.
Yeah, well done with that, Nate. Yeah,
just tell me I can't do something, especially if it's Chad. then I'll do it.
It's effective. But it's tantamount, if you're not familiar with the TSS nomenclature, if you know the training stress score, it's tantamount to just measuring kilojoules or kilocalories. I mean, you can bank or burn or expend 1,000 kcals or kjs riding at 60%, and you can get there much quicker riding at 90%. And they're going to take very different tolls on your body, and they're going to elicit different physiologic responses.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super important to understand.
There was one year I was trying to prepare for like what I knew was going to be a really, really big KJ week for a team camp. And so leading into it as kind of an experiment, I would just go out and see if I could hit 3,000 KJs in a ride. And that was sort of a game that I would play. It was like, how fast can I hit 3,000 KJs? And what I discovered was really hitting the gas and then taking off the gas and doing a really punchy ride would get me to, a higher KJ number faster than just trying to hit like a really sustained effort over that course. And again, like it was I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as a training strategy, but it was again, like approaching it with curiosity and looking at it as a learning process. It was really interesting to me to see that because it was the training adaptations that I was actually getting from those different rides was wildly different depending on the strategy I used to try to get to that KJ goal.
And Reese, I want you to take heart in a couple of examples. And I don't just plan to offer anecdotal evidence here today, but I can look at things I've done and I can see how that's happened to many, many other riders that I've coached, that I've simply observed that we know common sense. This applies to not just me, it applies to basically everybody. First off, we're all going to Cape Epic in March, pandemic, fingers crossed. We're going to be there and we have to have certain energy systems in line. We have to be good at sweet spot work. We have to have a bit of anaerobic capacity, a bit of neuromuscular, a ton of skill. And we have to have a fair amount of time in the saddle, a fair amount of a lot of aerobic endurance. All these things are going to be acquired. And I don't think any of us are going to go out and do a string of 6 or 7 hour days in a row. It's not going to happen. And we're still going to race well. I know we are. I've seen it happen too many times to know that it.
Nate, sorry, if you're listening on the
podcast. Me and Pete are.
Yeah. If you're listening on the podcast, Nate just smirked. So it was fantastic. Yeah.
But to back that up even more, my best road seasons, most of my races, at least the road races, were 3 hours plus. They were like 3.5 hours in my category in the Masters, et cetera. And I never did a training ride over 90 minutes, not one time. There were a couple of seasons where I was so strapped for time. If I could get in a 90-minute workout, and occasionally I could do 2 of those in a day because I was leading classes, that was a big day, but those were exceptional days. Typically it was a 90-minute workout and that was all I could get in on any one single day. And I raced extremely well that season and next season because I addressed all the necessary energy systems in training, and then I applied them rather effectively in racing. So it panned out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good example of that. I think that if we separate the whole thing for what you're looking at, in this case, Reese, you're looking to be specifically prepared for a specific event, right? Chances are, if it's climbing like that and it's long sustained climbs, chances are you pick the climbing, or plan builder pick the climbing road race for you if that's what you selected, or something like the rolling road race. And it's that sort of specificity that matters a whole lot more, because those are the energy systems that you use on race day, rather than just worrying about the overall number, the amount of TSS that you would have. And Amber, you mentioned something, and I see, Chad, that you have a note on this about fitness that's tough to maintain. That sort of approach of I'm just going to get to 3,000 kJs and I'm just going to try to do it as best as I can. It's funny because it builds you in, what we do, we are good at. And that's something that's really important to remember. In fact, we've already mentioned, I think, twice in different ways on this episode, but the more you do something, you'll be good at that specific thing. But that doesn't always necessarily mean that it was going to make you a better athlete for whatever task you have to accomplish. Like Amber, if you would have kept doing that, you would have been great at getting to 3,000 kJs in a specific way. But that's the sort of thing that breaks down on race day, right, Chad?
Yeah, certain types of fitness are easy gets. You can get them quickly, but you can also lose them rather quickly, and they're super hard to hang on to. And I've referred to this, and other coaches have as well, as brittle fitness. So it's not supple, it's not flexible like aerobic capacity or even muscle endurance, sweet spot work and slightly below, and even max strength if we're talking about being in the gym. So you can get this fitness quickly, it dissipates quickly, it's hard to hang on to. And that's my point.
Yeah. Amber. Yeah, fantastic point.
I don't know where to go with that.
I think you should always stop everything with that. And that's my point.
Yeah, that'll be Chad's signature.
Very Trumpish.
So Amber, one thing that we have here on our notes too that I think is important is you're mentioning the fact that it is totally doable to train for these events, and that's coming from you as a pro athlete. You've had experience doing this very thing.
Yeah, I often would train for huge stage races, 10-day stage races. It's not like I'm going to go out and simulate a 10-day stage race necessarily in my training. Number one, I think in cycling, when you're talking about these big events, Nate mentioned this earlier, it's just too hard to recover from efforts like this. And so you're better off with consistency, as Chad said, targeting these specific systems and then making sure that you can recover consistently from them. And one of the things so the point is that you can actually handle a really, really high TSS one-day event doing a low volume plan that doesn't have the same level of TSS week after week. And one way of thinking about this is, your FTP, it's your functional threshold power. It's the power at which you can theoretically, effectively shuttle lactate really well. So if you think about your FTP as a metric for shuttling, it's not like you have a separate shuttling system for a 1-hour ride that's different from the shuttling system for a 3-hour ride that's different from a shuttling system for a 6-hour ride. It's all the same system. So if your FTP is at a level where you know that you can shuttle at this particular power output, it's the same thing for a 1-hour ride as it would be for an 8-hour ride. Now that's of course subject to your pacing strategy and how well you're fueling and staying hydrated, but shuttling is shuttling. So when you train that system, even if you're training that system at a low volume, it's there. It's there no matter how long you want to go for a ride or how long your event is. That said, there are other metrics of endurance, right? So the fueling I mentioned, that's going to be a really important one. It's not just about making sure you're fueling enough and consistently through the event, but also you have palate fatigue, focus. So just maintaining a mental focus and the mental fatigue associated with being on the bike for a really long time. And that's of course related to fueling. And then you did mention being in the saddle, and that's its own special kind of endurance that we all know. But honestly, all of these things I think are very trainable on a low volume plan. And if you want to, you can, if you toss in maybe a few longer rides where you sort of test what it's like to be in the saddle for 4 hours, maybe 5 hours. You don't have to go do 9 hours on the bike to prep for a 9-hour event though. So just, I think you can be confident that on a low volume plan, you can train effectively for a longer event. And if the low volume plan is the thing that you can do consistently and recover from and not get sick from and not get injured from, that is your absolute best bet for preparing for even a really, really big TSS event.
Yeah, well said, Amber. Speaking of the high TSS events, we've already talked about Cape Epic and everything building into it. I know Sophia's got a new bike now that came out this week, the new Specialized Epic. Nate, you want to try it out, right?
I'm getting it.
Yeah.
I pulled up the numbers. So, yeah. Can we talk mountain bikes for a second, John?
Totally. Yeah. And in fact,
Cool.
it'll probably segue into a question. We'll just change up the order, but we'll keep talking mountain bikes after this. So.
Okay, so I have the Pivot Mach 4 SL right now. That's behind me. And I love that bike. The only issue, and it descends really well. The only issue, if you can see it, but the seat tube angle is not very steep. And because I have such a long seat tube, that actually puts me pretty far behind the rear wheel. And with the 120 fork, I've been having problems with the front wheel picking up. I've switched to a 100 millimeter fork, but I broke my rib the day that it happened, which I don't think I've mentioned. I don't remember if I mentioned on the podcast or not, but I broke a rib. So I wanted to, give Amber and Chad a chance. So anyways, the new Epic is the same, what's it called? Not C-tube angle. What am I thinking of? Head tube angle.
Head tube angle.
The new Epic in 100 millimeter fork is the same head tube angle as the Pivot in 120 millimeter fork, but the seat tube is 2 degrees steeper. So for me, that should help. And I've done all the things where I slam my seat forward on my Pivot, and I try to get like a forward offset with a dropper post, which apparently is hard to find. And then the other big difference is live valve. I really like live valve. And I think Keegan Swenson too, who you probably have heard about him on the podcast, U.S. National Champ, he uses live valve when he races, and he likes it a lot. So I'll be switching from that to the Brain. I didn't have a big issue with the Brain last time, but I'm also pretty dumb, I guess, for mountain bike suspension.
You're not dumb.
So, no, I mean, I just don't feel stuff like other people do. So we'll see. They've changed it again, and we'll see how good it is. But that is the plan for bikes.
It's exciting.
Yep.
Yeah, it's super smart to match your teammate with your bike, like, because then that way, for spares and for everything else, it just makes it more simple. You can
There's
carry.
one issue.
Oh, okay.
I'm getting this bike with SRAM, and she's on Shimano for her sponsor.
Yeah.
So that there could be issues with chains and stuff if we have to switch something out. So we're going to have double like drivetrain stuff.
Because that is the nice thing. If you can match drivetrains and you can match all that stuff, I think that Brandon and Amber are planning on matching. At least according to Brandon, I know that much, and it seems like Amber too. You're smiling. So, and then I think Chad and Pete are also planning on matching too with the SB100.
Yeah, that's the plan. Pete was kicking around getting an Epic, but it doesn't look like he has about as much chance of getting an Epic as he does getting a Yeti SB100. Both bikes are out of stock, so I guess it's maybe just going to boil down to what comes available first.
Yeah, for sure.
And Pete was going to get the Epic Evo, which has 110 millimeters, no Brain, 120 millimeter fork, slightly more slack. And for Pete and Pete's riding style, like that's a better bike for him. I think it's just a little bit heavier, right, John?
Yeah, that's it. I think it's a lot better because he's a rider that does a lot of manual input into the bike, and I know the Specialized engineer that made the Epic, so you probably wouldn't be too happy for me for saying this, but I feel like the Brain doesn't work as well for riders that do a lot of active input into the bike, meaning like you have a very active riding style where you're pressing into things and using your body to move the bike over things more actively rather than a more passive. In other words, like passive would be like sitting on the bike and pedaling it through or just letting the bike kind of roll through smoothly. So Pete's very much an active rider, like myself as well. So then as a result, you tend to feel the Brain interfering a bit more. But if he gets the Evo, he doesn't have to worry about that because there is no Brain. So, and when I say interfering, it's going to be doing you favors 99% of the time, and then 1% of the time, it might not, right? So, but all it takes is that one moment on the 1%, and then, you have a small crash or something. And those sort of things add up on those days. So it's going to be exciting. Brandon's getting fast. He and I raced heads up. I don't think we mentioned this on the podcast.
No, we didn't.
Yeah, so he and I did just a manufactured race, and we absolutely were social distancing, and I'll tell you why. Because when we started...
It wasn't a race, it was just a hard ride, not TR sanctioned.
Exactly. Hard Ride Wednesdays is what I'm calling it, but there's no official name because it's not an official thing. So, we were definitely social distancing because I blew Brandon's doors off for the first lap, and then he blew my doors off for every lap after that. So it did not work very well for me. But he's getting really fast, and his like improvement rate is so fast on descending. And I think, and just on everything. And I think that that's because of two things. Well, three things probably, but number one, and Nate, I'm sure you're going to mention genetics, that Brandon has a very good athletic genetics, right? Incredible athlete.
Well, VO2 max is insane.
Yep.
And no one's going to touch him.
Sure. He has a background as a kid in racing BMX, which is something that if you form those sort of habits when you're really young, it's really easy to get used to that stuff later on and to be able to improve quickly upon that. But then the final thing is Brandon has a growth mindset, and he's really dedicated to constantly improving and learning. And I think that really helps him overcome fear, because it's interesting in scenarios where we've stopped at a few rock gardens and he's like, which line do I take? And I'll point at the line and he'll be like, ooh, whoa. But then when it comes down to doing it, he trusts and he moves forward and he wants to improve. So he just makes sure that he has the basic bike handling principles in place and he can do anything. And it's really impressive to see. So I don't know. The Cape Epic thing's heating up. Hopefully the race happens, because otherwise, man, I don't know what we're going to do. But
my two things to plan on for against these Amber and Brandon was that Brandon wasn't going to be able to descend, which now he's almost as fast as me. And then I thought that Amber was going to take a long time to get to 4 watts per kilo, which she did in one block. So it's not looking good. I need to do something. I'm not sure. Maybe take drugs. But
that's been proven to be successful and also unsuccessful for many people. So
yeah, I'm just joking, everyone.
That's why we're laughing so hard.
Yes.
But then Chad, also, Chad, you guys went out with Chad, and Chad's actually a good mountain biker. Even though he hasn't mountain biked in like
I rode
while.
So we rode on a Saturday, and like we weren't, we were descending at probably at Brandon's like his race pace, I would assume, and Chad was basically just like shaving knobs off his tire the whole time. He was just like right on his wheel, just chilling. I don't know if you were going for a scare tactic, Chad, but you were like right there every time we stopped. So
yeah, no, he was a good tether. He kept me within my current bounds.
One thing that I think Brandon could work on, I think probably everybody, and it's a skill I want to be better at all the time, is riding close to somebody. That's a skill that when you can figure that out, it's really helpful, especially because you can use that to more comfortably make up for speed differentials in between you and your partner. So like if you're comfortable riding really close to them, then you can ride really close to them leading into a section where they're going to be able to pull away. And if it's 1 or 2 bike lengths, when you think of all the different times where you would have 1 or 2 bike lengths opening up and closing over the course of the day, that really adds up. That's a lot of little accelerations, and it exhausts you at the end of a week. And that's one thing that I think would really help. And that was interesting, Chad, that I saw you able to ride that close to Brandon, because that's a really good skill to have.
So how close in a descent do you think we should follow? Because that was going to be like enough where the dust has settled, because I want to see where she goes and if she slows down in front of me.
Sophia will be gone. If you wait for that, Sophia will be gone.
There's when I'm really close to someone, I go slower.
So no, you won't. You just match their pace. So the thing is, if you wait for dust to settle, you're too far behind the curve. You have to beat the dust. So you have to be there before the dust actually gets to the point where it starts to impede your vision. And if you look at top XC racers and top mountain bikers, the way they do that is they follow extremely closely. Now, like if you're asking what the ideal distance is, you're talking staying within a wheel length of their back wheel. But it takes a long time to get to that point, and that's a unique skill that I think probably the top cross-country racers are better than anybody else at, is riding really close to a rider in that regard. The way that you get used to that, it's not completely dissimilar to a pace line, and how you get used to riding in a pace line, and how you watch the shoulders of the rider ahead of you and over their head when you're in a pace line rather than staring at their back wheel. And it's the same thing with mountain biking. You don't want to stare at their wheel because then you're not looking ahead on the course, and then you're going to be making mistakes and constantly making small adjustments that will really wear you down. So it's about feeling how a trail is being ridden in general. Is the dirt supporting you to take whatever line you want, or do you have to take conservative lines? And if it's conservative, then everybody's probably going to follow the more conservative lines, so you can just relax and follow that. If the dirt becomes shaky and unsupportive, then at that point, you really know that you have to probably back off and give yourself an extra wheel. But in most cases, you can follow really close to a rider in front of you, especially if they're a good rider. Like Sophia, Nate, you can really trust that wheel. Like that's a great wheel to follow because she has so much skill. So it's an advantage for you in that regard if you can figure out how to ride close with confidence.
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen. I'll have to ride with her, but that's really scary because you can't see what's coming up, and then I overreact to stuff. Yeah, so that's probably not going to happen.
So get ready to drink. I'll mention Keegan again really quick, but when he came here, last year or something, we rode a legit downhill trail, like gnarly downhill trail on our XC bikes. And he had never ridden it, and he was like feet from my rear wheel the entire time, and I was going full on race pace. Now, he is a very good descender, way better than I am, but it also shows how that is a unique skill to develop. He was able to ride on a downhill course like that close to my tire, and just not even be phased. So that comes with time and putting yourself in that situation enough so that you become comfortable with it, and then trusting your bike enough as well.
And it also comes with trusting the rider in front of you too, because that does wonders for your self-confidence. I mean, you can be on a flat, fast road course, it's the technical criterium. And if you're on the wheel of someone who is very skilled and, maybe pushes your bounds a little bit and pulls you into a corner a little faster than you'd like, and you do it and you feel it and you suddenly realize I can do that, that translates to the trail. And I do recognize that on the trail, a lot scarier things can crop up. I mean, there's all sorts of surprises on a trail. There aren't very many surprises going into the same corner you've repeated 30 times. But if the rider in front of you is doing it really well and you trust that rider, and this is where I have to give major props to Pete. I know, he can definitely do things that I can't right now, but I know that he's aware of that, and he's going to lead me at a rate that is sustainable for me. He's not going to paint me into any corners.
That's actually a really big advantage for you two, because Pete, relative to me, much better descender, and we'll probably come out the same watt per kg, or we're always pretty close. But because he's not, like, between me and Sophia, there's a huge gap. But between Chad and Pete, there'll be a much smaller gap. So Pete riding conservatively or smooth might be the perfect speed for Chad. Where Amber and Brandon, who knows who're going to show up, but as of now, neither of you are as good as Pete. And I don't know, Amber might be.
No, that is a pretty good guarantee I'm not.
But there's probably less trust too between you two, because both of you know you're not like a high level mountain biker for descending yet, right? Is that
maybe, or maybe more, because we just I know that because of that, we're probably both going to ride a little bit more conservatively, right? So that could play into it as well. But I'm just laughing because Chad was saying, he knows if he follows Pete, like he can probably handle what Pete's doing. I was just recalling one of the first times I was on the track. The track is really intimidating and weird because it looks like you're just going to slide down the banking. And I just remember being behind, various riders on the track. And the only thing, like the one thought that consumed my entire brain was trust physics, trust physics, trust physics, trust physics.
You're such a nerd, Amber. It's great.
But it was like, I just kept thinking, the same laws of physics apply to that rider as apply to me. So if they're not sliding down, then I'm not going to slide down.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of that. In racing, in this case, you'll be racing with your teammate, but I find myself in many times in a cross-country race where I'm riding in front of a rider or behind a rider I don't know. And I instantly start collecting data on that rider, like what they're doing in different situations. And I also lend them a lot of trust. I have to totally admit, I lend them a ton of trust just from the get-go. And I assume if you're at this point in the race, chances are you're a good rider, you know what you're doing. And then I use the data to either, approve that or refute it and then make those decisions. But yeah, it's a skill. So it'll be exciting. Everybody should tune into the live ramp test. It'll be Tuesday, July 7th. That's getting really close, everybody. And we'll see where everybody's checking in on that one. So it'll be exciting stuff. Let's get into James' question because we have some more questions to knock out here before we get to the live questions that you're submitting on YouTube. He says, how trainable is one's power curve? And actually, can you first explain what a power curve is? Nate, can you explain what a power curve is?
Yeah, power curve is a graphical representation of how many watts you do for what duration. And they usually on the bottom have an exponential curve, or sometimes they don't, depending on what you do. So on ours is really cool because you can look at just the sprint or the endurance or all. because usually if you look at all of it, you lose a lot of detail at different levels. So what James is saying is that how much can I increase different parts of my duration? And I'm assuming James thinks there's probably some kind of genetic aspect that he's naturally good at. And he wants to know what he can do to change different parts of it.
Yep.
If it's even possible.
Great explanation. Yep. So he says, I realize, and just for a visual representation for people that might not be able to go through with that, think of something that starts up really high and then it hockey sticks down low, just because we're able to do much more power for a short duration as that duration gets shorter, right? And then it starts to flatten out as the duration gets longer. So he says, I realize that we can functionally train sprint efforts to boost the steep end, and if an athlete spends a lot, like 16 to 18 hours a week of time between zone 2 and sweet spot, is it possible that I would have a flatter power curve than normal? I find that I can function for a very long time, about 4 to 8 hours between zone 3 and sweet spot riding, but struggle to push over FTP, in large part because I rarely train above FTP. There we go again with the whole, we're good at what we do, right?
Yep.
So he says, I'm an ultra endurance athlete, and last year my shortest race was 5 hours and my longest one was 25. Ugh. That's longer than a day. I know we all know that, but I'm sorry, I'm just talking myself down from a ledge there, just hearing that. So he says, so the low and slow end of the curve is where I tend to focus. Is my curve truly flat, or am I just a wimp when it comes to working above FTP? Once again, probably not a wimp, but just once again, we're good at what we do, right? So Chad, the question, how trainable is a power curve? Let's go after it.
Yeah, in a word, very. It's incredibly trainable. So we can look at it from a couple different perspectives. And let's start with just the muscle fibers. So let's get down into the nitty gritty. Not going to take it all the way down to the cells. Let's step up a bit, look at the fibers. And I want to say from the outset here, regardless of your genetic predisposition, which is, the reason a lot of people talk themselves out of things before they even try them, you can in fact target specific fibers. And this means you can target specific energy systems. And when you target those fibers, you can also target adaptations within those fibers. So one fiber isn't capable of one thing. Our fibers are on a spectrum and they can do all things to some degree. So to elaborate on that, if you do a bunch of aerobic work, like you said, the Z2 on up to sweet spot, you're going to get more aerobic adaptations. But what people don't realize is you can get those aerobic adaptations in fast twitch anaerobic fibers. Because again, there are components, aerobic components in these fast twitch fibers. And this is the very essence of slow force work. This is why you'll have a sprinter doing low force work early on in the season, because they're trying to train some aerobic influence into their fast twitch fibers. These guys have to be able to get to the line before they can unleash that sprint. Then if you look at a rider who does more anaerobic work, obviously they're going to get more anaerobic adaptations, but these anaerobic adaptations can carry to those intermediate fibers, those fibers that carry a lot of characteristics of both the slow twitch and the fast twitch. And this is going to push them a little more anaerobically inclined. It's a specific adaptation to impose demand on cilia. I mean, this is how the body works. This is how our muscles work. If there's a dearth of recruitment work, you're not doing neuromuscular innervation work, you're going to have a sucky peak power output. You're not going to be able to elicit or generate a big peak torque. If you don't do much anaerobic capacity work, you're probably going to have a curve that plummets or maybe just starts slow and stays low. If you haven't trained it and if you haven't done it, it's not going to make it into your data magically. You have to at some point do it. And if you're not very capable of doing it, well, it's not going to be a big departure from your lower end power. Then if we look at things from the perspective of fueling, and this is an easy get, especially considering the popularity of going low carbohydrate or doing fasted rides. Yes, you get aerobic adaptations. And namely, we're targeting greater mitochondrial biogenesis, which basically means a greater ability to metabolize fat and then make a bit more energy out of the sugar that we ingest, but it also really limits your workout options during that workout. And on top of it, you're probably costing yourself a bit of muscle. You're going to metabolize some amino acids. Some of those amino acids are going to come from your muscle. The longer you do it, the more are going to come from your muscle. So if you're big on fasted rides, you have to make sure you're replenishing in excess your protein. And then when it comes to high carbohydrate riding, which is basically necessary, this opens up the door to a myriad of workout options, but it limits your fat utilization. In a workout, as soon as you ingest carbohydrate, put sugar into the system, it shuts off your fat burning capabilities. Your body's, it's shifting focus. The two don't play nice. And if you have this consistently high carbohydrate intake over time, you run the risk of becoming a carbohydrate reliant rider. But these are all things that can be managed. You just have to recognize that this is to use the term again, the corner you're painting yourself into.
One thing to add to that too is, once again, if we're chasing performance, right? This is the important thing when you talk about fueling strategies and chasing performance. If performance is the goal, you have to make sure that you're fueling the work.
Relative to what you're looking to accomplish, yes.
Yep, exactly. Another way to express a power curve too is that your power curve doesn't define you as an athlete. Like you just said, Chad, there's a lot of adaptations that can be made across even people with highly one-sided fiber type makeups, whatever they have. Your power curve doesn't define you as an athlete. It just shows your work in many cases. That's just, yeah, sure, you may have a facility toward one specific type of work, but that doesn't mean that you can't train the other one. So really, you should view your power curve as just, a report card almost, like a showing of where you've been, what you've been working on, and this is where you're at. So the more you change it, the more you'll see a difference.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that I like that because I think it's more about shaping your power curve intentionally to fit your goals. So don't think of it as like, oh, I was born with this kind of power curve. It's like, shape the power curve to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. So if your events are all ultra endurance, what do you really need? I mean, and then that begs the question, what does it mean to be a quote unquote wimp above FTP? If you're not training those systems, then when you do tap into those systems, you're going to have a higher perceived exertion because you're not used to those specific kinds of sensations. It's going to feel harder because you haven't been training those. So what? Do you really need them? Like, I am a total wimp at running, and I am A-okay with that. I'm not doing running events. Like, I am good with that, but it's just, what is it that you want? What's the, right? What is it that you want? What is, you may not be great at those systems above their threshold, but if you don't really need them, who cares?
Yeah. Yeah. Great way to put it.
And do keep in mind, this is all we're saying is that specificity matters. It does, but I think what a lot of people miss is that it matters psychologically too, because you can gain a lot of improvement from simple familiarity. You expose yourself to a workout, say it's 30-30s, something you haven't done before, and it's miserable the first time. But next week, or maybe even a couple days later, you do the same workout, it's more tolerable, just like that, because now you know what to expect. And that's entirely psychological. Nothing physiological has happened in that span of time that's going to amount to any real benefit to that workout. But you understand the pain. You're even just slightly more familiar with it than you were, and you have a better workout because of it.
Yep.
Huge difference.
Amber, do you have anything else that you wanted to cover on this one? Or we're all set, right?
No, I'm good on this one. Yeah.
Cool. Let's go into a question from Thomas. This isn't necessarily mountain bike talk, especially these days. But Thomas's question, he says, any advice on going tubeless for mountain biking and anything in general with tubeless? Or he says anything in general. So I think he's talking about different disciplines of riding. Can you do it yourself? And do you really need tubeless rims or tires, or can you just spray sealant into a normal mountain bike tire? So we've covered tubeless a handful of times on this before, but Nate, I think you've gone to like tubeless across the board on all your bikes, right?
Oh yeah.
Road, everything across the board.
Everything. Yes.
Yeah. What would you say in this case? Yes or no?
Like, to go tubeless?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm never going back. There's always two, and like in a race, at the end of the race, there'll be like a little bit of sealant on my tire, and I'm like, whoa, that saved me. And the rolling resistance is there, the weight is there. I don't know why you would go tubes at all. To me, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and when you say
it's a pain a little bit.
It is, yeah. When you say rolling resistance and and weight is there, you mean that the advantage is there, not that the fact that they have more rolling resistance and more weight.
It's advantage rolling resistance, and then weight is pretty much a wash between the sealant and the tire, and then the tube in a regular tire.
Yeah. So I have like a handful of tips. I've screwed up tubeless so many times. And even in the middle of Valley of the Sun stage race, Nate remembers this. I was like out the night before the crit, late, trying to fix tubeless issues. So let me say this. You came to the race, you're like, yeah, my tire doesn't seal.
he's at the race. He's like, yeah, I've been sealing for a while. And then he's trying to fix it the day before the whatever 90-mile road race.
Yeah, I make bad decisions. Don't be like me. It was one of those things where I thought it was sealed, and then I went to go pack it in the bike bag, and it wasn't sealed. And then by the time you go and pack it in the bike bag, that's a little too late. So crazy times. But I've learned a bunch from it. So I want to share like some tips and some things that I do to basically just set it up for the least amount of errors. And maybe I just change so many wheels and tires that I have more errors, or maybe these are really bad tips. You be the judge. But regardless, so first, I would absolutely recommend getting a tubeless tire and tubeless rim match, meaning making sure they're actual tubeless tires. Usually the difference between that, most tubeless rims don't have hooked beads. So if you're joining us on YouTube, you can actually see my hands here, but we're talking about the walls of the rim that the tire presses against. And if it's a hookless bead, that means that it more or less is just like a rectangle, kind of leaning in one direction or another, right? And it's just a smooth side. However, if it's hooked, it's going to have a bulge, and that bulge is going to have like a male-female mating surface that you'll have with the tire, so that the tire has a bulge that kind of locks in underneath that. Now, tubeless doesn't have that because many times that's less surface area, and it's tougher for sealant to get in there and to seal, so then it doesn't seal as well. Also, in many cases, tubed tires and tubeless tires, the interior of them the design is different. So if you run a tubeless tire with a tube, a lot of the time it'll be abrasive and it can actually hurt the tube, that sort of a thing. And vice versa. If you run a tire that isn't made for tubeless, many times the sealant just covers the entire surface of the tire and dries out really fast. So above all, the biggest thing with that is if you aren't running tubeless specific tires and rims, then you can have a blowout because they aren't designed to hold on to the rim in a tubeless setup like that. And that's super scary. That would be like descending and your tire comes off or something. That'd be like the worst case scenario. So do everything that you possibly can to get a tubeless proper setup. And now it's getting much more approachable in terms of price. Like you could go with a company like Stan's. They make wheels they're really affordable and really good. And of course they're tubeless, being Stan's. That's kind of their whole deal. So, and plenty of other brands too that you can get with that. So my tips, first of all, in my experience, all sealant is basically the same. Like I've heard people saying like, yeah, I tried Stan's and it totally didn't work, but then I tried Orange Seal and it blew my mind, and it's incredible. But in my case, I've had flats that seal and don't seal with all of them. And really all essentially it is just, it's some pocket lint and some glitter mixed in with some latex. That's it. That's really all it is. So I know that, Specialized has a specific one that's supposed to work really well. I tried that, and it was ironically, I got like a flat that I totally thought should have sealed with their tire and their new sealant. So it's sealant, and I don't think there's an advantage one way or the other.
You're going to get emails. You know this.
Oh, I know. I'm totally going to. Yeah. People, I bet the YouTube comments are just lighting up right now. But that's the hard thing, because if you use the sealant, it's like a bias thing, right? A confirmation bias thing. You use the sealant and you have a hole that probably wasn't going to seal with anything, so you blame the sealant. And then you have a hole that was going to seal no matter what you had in it, so you blame the sealant for that success as well. So hindsight always affects what we're looking at. So keep that in mind. The one thing that I will say is some of them have endurance sealant, or like Orange Seal does, or Stan's has some other ones like a race sealant. That race sealant's really aggressive and it does do a better job of sealing. However, it will clog your valve cores pretty darn quickly. So you just have to think about that. If you're going to be swapping this out and servicing your wheels all the time, then run the race sealant. If not, then I would run their standard stuff. Okay, so first of all, a sealant injector is so good to use. And KOM Cycling, I think, Chad, that's the brand, right? I think the owner might listen to the podcast, which kudos and thank you for making this, because this is a really good product. You can get the small little bottles that you just take the valve core out when you put the sealant in and then squeeze the sealant in there. But then the sealant is coating the inside of your valve stem. And so then that way, when you put your valve core back in, it's bathed in sealant, and then it's just guaranteed to clog. And we all know if you've used tubeless, the frustrating thing about that's like when you use the pump and you push your pump down and then you have to wait for like 5 seconds as the needle pressurizes and it gets down to where it needs to be. And that makes it so that you don't always get accurate pressure readings if you're using a pressure gauge. So you may be at a very different pressure than you actually think you are, which really matters. The tire pressure is super important. So
the KOM Cycling guys have added a little stop valve at the tip which means you can fill the reservoir without getting it all over the place. I used it the other day. I got the new one. I used it the other day. Is the first time in my entire history of going tubeless that I haven't gotten sealant anywhere. There wasn't a speck of it. It was entirely in the tire or in the injector.
It's one of the first tips is you will get something messy in almost every case. So don't do this on your nice new carpet or floor or something like that. Make sure you're in a spot where can have some towels laid out and such. But it's really nice because that sealant injector actually puts the hose down into your tire through that spot. And then you inject the sealant there, and then it's just much cleaner and much easier. So it's really good. And then for valve cores, you can actually buy like valve cores in bulk for pretty cheap from either a bike shop or online retailer. And I would just buy I think the last set of valve cores I bought, I think it was $10, and I think that I got like 15 or 20 valve cores for like $10. It was pretty cheap. I could be totally wrong, but check the prices.
Well, while we're on that topic of valve cores, the valves themselves, the tubeless valves, they have a rubber bottom that's shaped a particular way. And I had one that was slightly misaligned for the longest time, and I couldn't get it to seal. And then I finally let the tire go slack and just gave it a tiny little adjustment, and it seated where it was supposed to be. So the whole time I was working against an unknown issue.
Yep, super good point. So you should have an O-ring at the base of that valve stem that you put in. It should be pushed up against the tape of that tire when you put it in. So, and it should be mated in there pretty well. Okay, so number one, like you said, it will be messy. Number two, tape. For some reason, I do not understand why we're still using tape for tubeless tires. It's crazy to me why we don't have a better solution than this. But you can get rim tape. You can also use Gorilla Tape, but the most important thing is that it's cut and sized very specifically for the width of your internal width of your rim. If it isn't, you can totally get by, but it just means that you're more likely to have a leak. Whatever you do, don't make it so that it's wider than the internal width of your rim, because then it will creep up the sides of the rim, and then your tire will always end up pushing it and moving it, and then it will always leak. And that's the leak that you can't figure out when you air everything up and everything seems sealed, but air is coming out of your spoke holes and you're wondering what's going on. It's because you have a tape problem. So if you have that problem where sealant isn't leaking out, but you just have air coming out of your spoke holes, or you can hear air escaping from somewhere, you've got a tape problem. The best way to tape is to involve another person. I know you can do it alone, but if you have another person, it makes it super easy because you really want that tape to be extremely tight. So when you put it on, keep your hand there and then pull it extremely tight every time as you tape around that rim. And then usually, like, common practice is to go 4 spoke holes another direction or in each direction of your valve stem when you finish and start the taping. That way you can have plenty of surface. I really like the muck off tape, DT Swiss tape as well. It seems like it's a bit more durable than the standard like stand stuff that I've used. So, and the DT Swiss stuff that I use is like, it actually has DT Swiss branding on it, the black stuff, not the red tape. That's my favorite with that. If you're using inserts in your tires, which I think everybody moving forward is going to start using inserts in cyclocross and gravel tires, every single person. I don't know why you wouldn't, especially with those ones. When you use inserts, put that inside the tire first and then put your tire on. And when you're putting your tire on, something that I forget all the time, and it's really important, is to make sure your bead is entirely in the center of the rim. Not up on the bead, but the tire is squeezed into the center of the rim. It's going to make your life so much easier, and that's how people can put tires on without tire levers. So it's and tire levers can be really bad for your paint or for your tape. You put a tire lever down in there to try to leverage a tire off or on, and it can scratch the tape, and then you've got a leak, and you have to do the whole thing over again. It can be really frustrating. This is really selling Tubeless, by the way. Everyone's
Well, I have some pro tips after you're done.
Cool. So when you pop the one thing too, before you even put in sealant, I would recommend putting the tire into the center of the bead, taking your valve core out, and then using the air to pop the tire onto the bead. That makes it really easy because then you don't get a mess once you start introducing sealant into things. Then all you do is you take the pump off, air will rush out, but your tire will stay on the bead. And then you can put that sealant in with the sealant injector through your valve stem, put the core in, pump it up to whatever pressure you want, and it's really helpful. If your bead doesn't want to come on, you can take a little bit of soapy water and you can just put it on the edge of the bead, and that will make your bead much more eager to slide up against the surface of the tape or the rim, and it can pop on. It can make it really easy. And then if you're really having a problem, because certain tires, we've noticed this, right, Nate, like some wheels and tires aren't perfect diameter matches, where we've had it where like one tire is looser on a rim than another tire might be, and vice versa. So it can be really frustrating because you're trying to pop that tire onto the bead, but it just won't do it because it's too large. And if you do have that case, it's kind of a janky move. But what you can do is you can take your tie down and you put it around the outside of your tire and like a standard tie strap, and you tighten it down. And that can press the tire up against the rim and make it so that it's a lot easier to actually pop onto the bead. It can be really helpful. And then you also don't need a compressor, especially these days as tire and wheel manufacturers are getting better. It will make your life easier, but you don't necessarily need one. And then don't go with one of those, or at least in my experience, I have like a Bontrager pump that also has a tubeless inflator. And it's like the most destructive item in the universe. Anything I put it around, because it weighs like a ton and it's made of metal, it just seems to destroy. It's clumsy and it's a bad pump and a decent tubeless inflator. So I'd rather have a really good pump and then have a better tubeless inflator, which might just be your pump, or you can get one of those little cans. You can fill that up and then you just put that onto the tire, turn the valve, and it'll just pop it right on. It's a lot cheaper and more portable than using a compressor for sure. Then 2 more things. Don't overinflate. Check the tire pressure recommendations from your rim and tire, and whatever's lowest, stick with that. Because you can go with some tubeless ones, and when you pump up the tire too much, it can actually blow off the bead, and that's terrifying because it's basically like a tire explosion, and it'll throw sealant everywhere, and it can even damage the tire and be really dangerous to the person installing it. So don't overinflate for sure. And the last thing is check your pressure and your sealant regularly. You will lose pressure gradually with tubeless. So just get in the habit of always checking your pressure before you ride, as you should anyway. And then you can check your tubeless sealant by letting the pressure out, and then you take your valve core out, and then you can use just anything, a stick, some sort of dipstick, so to speak. Just put it down at the bottom of the tire and see if there's sealant in there. If it comes out wet, then you're probably fine on your sealant, and you don't need to drain out any sealant or take out the old sealant and put new stuff in. But it will dry out over time, so you have to check on that. I think those are all the tips that I've had that have helped me go through the tubeless thing. How about you, Nate?
Okay, so here's what you do. You take it to the bike shop.
I knew it.
And for like $5 a wheel or something, it will literally, like, we do this. We were lucky to have Rich at Great Basin here, but like 4 minutes they do it. And then if it doesn't seal, you take it back and they fix it for free. And I've had it where 3 hours on one tire, the frustration, oh my goodness. Like, it is, bike shops need it. Let's support the industry. All those things you had to buy and check and all that knowledge, spend a couple bucks and do it. And the second one, if you're on the trainer, make sure you're like, really, it's like, that's.
Should we just cut
like,
that whole section from the podcast?
No, because you just sold bike shops. So bike shop, you this is like when you go to one of those, what's it called? Not the will, but the trust. You go to one of those trust meetings and a lawyer explains what you can do to a trust, and you're like, wow, I'm never doing that. I'm going to pay someone to do that. So you just did that for bike shops. So thank you, John.
You're welcome, bike shops. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you're on the trainer and you're not going outside for a while, make sure you spin your wheel or like once in a while to get the sealant everywhere, because you had it, or even if you keep it pumped up, it will lose its speed. You just got to make sure that it gets wet once in a while all the way around. And if you keep them, if you spin them pretty often and you keep the pressure up, they stay inflated for a very, very long time. And if they get deflated, sometimes you can put a little bit extra seal in it, pump back up, spin it, and then it's good.
Yep.
But if you don't like all the pain John just said, you gave me anxiety like while you were doing that.
While I'm reading it off, I'm like, why do I do this? Why do I do it?
Yeah, especially like, I don't know how much other bike shops cost, but our guy charges too little for doing it. So it's nice.
Yep. Let's get into James' question, and then we'll go into the live questions. He says, first off, thank you for the 5-star podcast. Found it via a friend's recommendation during lockdown and have now spent many days in your company getting faster. Good to hear. That's the goal. So he says, here's my question. My professional background covers many sectors that I won't bore you with here, but essentially I specialize in decision-making under uncertainty and nothing to do with physiology. In my time coaching people in this area, I've always preached things like proper rest, recovery, nutrition, hydration, and sleep. These things seemed intuitive, and I would always see performance decreases in people that neglected these areas. And he mentions that this is just bro science, he says, because these are just his observations. He says, this seems to be backed up by research done by serious people like Daniel Kahneman, things like how System 1, instinctive, and System 2, deliberative, thinking are affected by glucose levels. we revert to instinct and generally make worse effortful decisions. Of course, this has implications for training, and he says that we are aware of. Cyclocross dismounts must be committed to muscle memory. Transitions must be meticulously planned, and of course, everyone has a plan until they're handed a warm Camelback. Sorry, Nate. I apologize. Still, poor Leadville experience. He says the muscular system and the nervous system do not exist in isolation and share a resource in glucose, and I'm sure others, but we take a siloed approach to training them many times. I was thinking about this after I tried to work out the percentage of interval remaining, and I noticed my heart rate bumping up a bit. I read somewhere on the internet, and he says, bro. Good morning there. He says, read somewhere on the internet that the nervous system uses about 80% of our glucose. So I was wondering, is that likely a hard limit or a trainable limit? And could there be physiological benefits to adding System 2-esque cognitive load to workouts? If so, which workouts? So his bro science disclaimers are in there. Amber, how do you want to address this one?
Well, I know Chad's got some here too, but I just want to kick this off with a really cool, fun fact. So, fun fact, the human brain is about 2% of body weight, but on average, it burns about 20% of the calories consumed by the body, which is crazy. So that's a 10x difference. And then if you're just at rest, like if you're just kind of sitting at resting metabolic rate, that can get up to like 60% of calories used by the whole body. And Chad's going to elaborate on that. So the brain uses a ton of energy, and it uses almost exclusively glucose. The only time it's not using glucose for energy is during prolonged starvation. That's when it would shift over to ketones. But generally speaking, the brain uses a bunch, and it's mostly glucose. So I'm going to turn that over to Chad and let him take it away on this front.
Yeah, it's mostly glucose, and there's always some glucose involved based on the quite a lot of stuff that I've read over the years, really. It doesn't necessarily require prolonged starvation to get into ketones production. I mean, you can basically do an evening depletion ride where you run your glycogen, your muscle glycogen low, and then by morning your ketones will be elevated. So it doesn't take a long time. Your body, the more metabolically flexible, the more easily you'll shift in and out of ketone production, fat utilization, back to carbohydrate, et cetera. That is the very definition, or essence, I should say, of metabolic flexibility. There's actually quite a lot to unpack here, James. So let me start by first, excuse me, differentiating between muscle and liver glycogen. And for anyone who doesn't know, all glycogen is glucose molecules bound together. So you get a single molecule of glucose is what goes into the cell, and then that's what helps us turn over ATP, create energy, et cetera. So all these glucose molecules bind together into glycogen particles. And they're stored in a number of places, but with regards to endurance sport training, what we're concerned with, we're looking at predominantly the muscles, but also what's going on in the liver. And as you stated, James, it is kind of looked at as though they operate in a silo, but to some extent they do, because once it's in the muscle, it stays in the muscle. The glucose is never funneled back into the bloodstream except by a very indirect route that I explained with the Cori cycle and gluconeogenesis, and it gets rather complex. But the fact is, if it's in the muscle, it's pretty much going to stay in the muscle. The liver, however, is different in that respect, because once it's in the liver, it's basically available to anywhere in the body. Predominantly, that is in fact the brain. And as Amber stated, the human brain, and by extension, the central nervous system, is actually a glucose hog. That's for real. But when you say 80% of our glucose, you're referring to 80% of our blood glucose. And that's not a heck of a lot of glucose, because at any one time, if you look at David Wasserman's paper back from 2009, it's titled very succinctly and pithily, 4 grams of glucose, because for normal bodily function, there's about 4 grams of glucose present in the bloodstream at all times. And yes, this does change based on the size of the person. So this is describing a 70 kilogram or 150 pound person. And this also assumes certain things, one of which is that there's no metabolic disorder. This is not a person who is in a hypoglycemic state, low blood sugar. They're not in a hyperglycemic state, perhaps postprandially, they've just eaten a meal, or, someone verging on metabolic disorder, either pre-diabetic or full-on type 2 diabetic. But the point simply is that blood sugar is tightly regulated. Basically, it's a combination of insulin or glucagon, and the two basically counter each other. So we're talking about a sedentary fasted person here. And as Amber just stated, about 60% of the glucose that's in their blood is going to be metabolized by the brain. An interesting side note is this doesn't really change during sleep. Our brains are very metabolically active 24/7. So whether we're sleeping, whether we're awake, glucose hog. So I think some of the confusion around this might arise from a resource that I leaned pretty heavily on in my early coaching days. It was a book written by Georg Newman Georg, I'm not sure how to say it, Newman, and a couple other authors way back in 2000. So in my early days as a coach, 2005, 2006, this was a very important textbook. I learned a lot from this book. And the claim there is that liver glycogen has that the storage capacity of the glycogen in your liver is in fact trainable. And the contention, he also contended that, or these authors also stated that so is muscle glycogen. And time has shown us, and time and much research has shown us that yes, in fact, muscle glycogen is in fact very trainable. On average, a sedentary male can pack away about 300 grams of muscle glycogen, whereas a trained individual can push that up to 500, 600, 700 grams of glycogen in their muscle. So we know this is real, but the claim with this particular book was that the liver basically on average held about 80 grams, but we could train that up to about 120 grams. This was actually incorrect because Javier Gonzalez, who's actually a brilliant resource on all things sports nutrition, did a study back in 2016, and they used MRS, so magnetic resonance spectroscopy. I mean, they actually used imaging to look how much glycogen is in the liver right now, how much glycogen is in the muscle right now. And they confirmed that while there is a range, it's basically untrainable. It's not something that trains. The range is effectively based on the size of the liver, quite honestly. So, and that range, and this is based on a study or some research done by Murray and Rosenblum back in 2018. They cited that liver glycogen ranges between 0 and 160 grams. So that what that tells us is two things. One, we can deplete our liver glycogen. And two, there's a big range. So if you take a 100-pound female and stack her next to a 200-pound or 300-pound male, or let's say a 200-pound lean mass, both of these people aren't carrying a lot of excess body weight, you're going to see a big difference in the amount of glycogen they can pack away in a liver that's different in size. Mm. They also noted, and this is very interesting because it flies in the face of something I was uncertain of, or I thought I was certain of, in that muscle glycogen stores can be run down to about 10% of their initial content. Whoa. So based on their research, we can run it very low. But as I stated previously, a couple podcasts ago, we can't run it completely empty because the result is one thing. It's rigor. It's a contraction that cannot be released. So there's always some glycogen content in the muscles. But even though it's not trainable in the liver, the liver glycogenolysis is actually lower in endurance athletes, which simply means the rate of glycogen breakdown. So the glycogen that's in the liver that's broken down into individual glucose molecules, kicked out into the bloodstream and used wherever it's necessary, actually slows down because as conditioned athletes, we're better at doing certain things. And one of those things is in fact metabolizing fat, but I think most of this is attributed to the fact that we see hormonal shifts, hormonal changes over the course of training. Our body does different things with, in particular, epinephrine, norepinephrine, but also that glucagon I mentioned and the insulin. We see different activity in these hormones because our body has learned and adapted to different demands. So it's not really the liver's capacity, but its utilization of glycogen that we should be concerned with. And that, in fact, is trainable, or it does respond to training, I should say, because effectively it's almost like our liver is learning to conserve brain resources. It wants to hold that sugar aside so that we can fuel the brain in all contexts, regardless of how hard our muscles are working.
So smart.
Very smart, incredibly smart. This is endlessly fascinating.
So cool.
So this leads me to a statement that I will stand behind and argue with anybody, and that fatigue is in the brain. Because as I just said, our muscles are never fully depleted. Yes, we can run them very low. Yes, we end up slowing down. Yes, our peak power and our motivation and all these things kind of tank. But when our brain is low, we see all these basically debilitating signs of low blood sugar. I mean, we get shaky. We experience the chills, sweating, and clamminess, confusion. A higher than usual and much higher in some cases heart rate, you get lightheaded, you get dizzy, and you experience hunger. And in most cases, it's severe hunger. You'll eat pretty much anything that's edible. So
confirm.
based on this,
In there.
I've shown this to be true too. A lot of athletes have. I think it's logical to assume that the maintaining liver glucose is what staves off the dreaded bonk. It might as well just be called low blood sugar. It might as well just be called low brain sugar, because we're not low on muscle sugar. I mean, we're relatively low, yes, but we're not out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So with all this said, there's actually hope, because Javier Gonzalez also did a study prior to the one that I just mentioned. He did this in 2015, where he demonstrated that glucose or sucrose ingestion, so basically just eating a bit of sugar, and sucrose is just glucose and fructose. So any combination of monosaccharides during exercise can suppress and even abolish hepatic glucose output. So the liver that the glycogen that's in your liver that's getting converted to glucose kicked into the bloodstream, we can shut that way down by eating a little bit of sugar. And in this experiment, they used anywhere from 0.7 grams per minute to 1.7 grams per minute. And that translates to about 40 grams per hour. Very easy to ingest for just about anybody, all the way up to about 100 grams per hour. And as we've learned, that's going to have to be a combination of a couple sugars, because if we dump 100 grams of glucose into the system, we're probably going to deal with some gastric issues. So in this case, they use sucrose, which is that very combination. And basically at the lower end of things, with that 40 grams per minute, they cut way down on the amount of liver glycogen that was depleted. When they bumped it all the way up to 100, didn't even touch it. And I'm sure there was some, but it must have been statistically insignificant, because they said it eliminated or abolished that output.
Wow.
And I do feel like I should say, and I should probably say this more often than I do, yes, we cannot look at single studies in isolation. We also always have to look at the entire body of literature on our topic. So it's really easy to read a study and say, oh, this is everything I want to hear. I'm going to buy into this wholeheartedly. But I will tell you, I've spent the better part of the last 2, even 3 days looking at this very topic, and everything seems to stand up, even though the most recent research I looked at in here was a 2018 study. And I'm sure a couple of things have cropped up over the last couple of years that may counter some of this, but I can't imagine anything completely refuting it. So to sum it up, liver glycogen supercompensation. So, this bump in the storage capacity of glycogen in our liver, probably not a thing, but the depletion is pretty easily avoided nutritionally. So the short answer, James, is that physiologically, and I'm going to sick Amber on the other end of things because she's more equipped for it. My view is that this aspect of endurance performance probably is not trainable.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I was looking at on that, so, that's looking at kind of our ability to store and use and store glycogen, get glucose into the bloodstream, which is where the brain's going to be pulling it from. And then looking at how the brain is using energy stores, not just, so one of the things that is interesting about the brain is the machinery itself is really expensive. So just maintaining the machinery is very, very expensive. And then activating that machinery, of course, takes, again, more energy. But what's interesting is it seems that at least the most expensive part is the maintenance, and that the activation of the machinery then is a little bit less expensive, probably because it's so expensive to maintain the machinery. So looking at that kind of from a quantitative perspective, they've done imaging studies of the brain, and you can imagine, I'm sure most of you have kind of heard of some of these at least, where depending on the type of cognitive task, like if you're learning a new language, a certain area of your brain is going to light up, right? Like you're never going to be like just turning the whole thing on or off. So what ends up happening is your brain, depending on what type of cognitive task you're using, is going to increase glucose consumption wherever that activity is taking place in the brain. And that's usually an increase on the order of less than 5%, which doesn't really seem like a whole lot. That said, when you're thinking about, when we're talking about activities that use multiple senses, like playing a musical instrument, learning to play a musical instrument, or riding bikes and racing bikes, those tend to have a higher metabolic cost, because as you can imagine, there's going to be more areas of the brain lighting up and activating to accomplish those tasks. But still, it's not a huge, we're not looking at like a 50% increase here. We're looking at, pretty small differences. And that's the quantitative side of things. But if you think about that qualitatively, it's like, okay, well, that's not a huge increase. But then again, when you imagine, put yourself back in your own shoes where you've been at your limit before, really, really small changes can have a huge qualitative effect when we're at our limit. I mean, I know for a lot of us doing sweet spot, like sweet spot is a range, and increasing or decreasing a couple of percent from, 88% to 94%, it can make a really big difference in how we're perceiving the effort. So even a 5% or less change in energy usage in the brain might have a significant effect. I say might because I don't have any hard science to back that up, but just looking at the numbers and imagining, we get to a point where we can start detecting some pretty small differences at those areas.
That's Nate's line typically.
You're stealing my catchphrase.
I know, right? So we know that even small differences can have a big effect. And when we were talking with Justin, he even mentioned, Justin Williams, not many people train themselves to think when they go really hard on the bike. And that's a really, really true statement. And there's a couple of studies that aren't directly addressing how much more glucose we might be using while we're riding the bike at the same time as engaging in a high cognitive load. I haven't been able to find anything on that specifically, but there's a couple of studies that are really interesting. So these looked at what's called response inhibition, and you can think of this as impulse control. So this is the kind of thing where if something gets really uncomfortable, your impulse is to stop that thing, right? So you start into a VO2 max effort and it is not fun. It is the opposite of fun. And your impulse is, this sucks, I'm out, just shut it down. But if you can control that impulse and force yourself essentially override the impulse to finish out that interval, to sit in that discomfort, that's response inhibition. So you can imagine this is really, really important to performance. So one of these studies was looking at, they used what's called the Stroop task, which is you look at a series of words that flash on a screen, and each of the words are colors. So blue, green, red, for example. If the word itself is the same color as the word, so the word blue appears as blue, it's really easy to identify what the word is. But the second that the word blue shows up in the color red, it becomes a lot harder to identify what the word is without thinking of the color. So they call that matched or unmatched with the color. So what the study did was they had athletes, I think they were runners, look at 30 minutes of the Stroop test. So they had to identify the word over 30 minutes. And some of these were matched with the color and some were unmatched. So if they're matched with the color, super easy. If they're unmatched, it's really, really high cognitive load. What they found was for the people who had, the control group showed, they did a 5K test. The control group showed like no difference in performance. But for the people who had it unmatched, where they had really high cognitive load for 30 minutes ahead of this 5K test, their rate of perceived exertion during the 5K test was significantly higher, and they went 6% slower. And what was interesting about this was after the Stroop test, nobody reported feeling mentally fatigued. So they didn't actually even identify that they were mentally fatigued, but you could see that there was a shift in how they were pacing themselves and how they were perceiving their exertion in that effort. So that was one data point that's really interesting on this. The second one was a study that looked at professional versus amateur cyclists. And again, they're looking at response inhibition in particular. And they did the same thing, the Stroop test. So what was fascinating about this was the professional cyclists, and they were looking at cyclists in particular, the professional cyclists actually got a significantly higher number of these Stroop test questions correct versus the amateurs. So the pros got, I think, 705 correct in the study, and the amateurs were 576 were correct. So right off the bat, the pros were showing a higher degree of response inhibition. And then they did a cycling test following that. The amateurs, after that cognitive load, showed a 4.4% decrease in power output, whereas the pros showed no decrease. So this is a really interesting study because it doesn't give you a mechanism. It doesn't say like this is why, or confirm that this is either trainable or innate. So we have kind of a chicken or the egg question here. But I like to think, and this is my opinion only, I like to think that this must be something that you can train. So thinking of this in terms of system 2 and system 1, system 2 being the more deliberate thinking system 1 being the more reactive, intuitive. Again, this kind of goes back to what we've talked about before with cognitive economy. So your very first bike race, it's all going to be system 2. You're going to be using system 2 to deliberately think about when to brake, when to shift, where to put yourself in the bike race. Whereas somebody like Justin, who gave us the example of having raced 2 crits a week for 15 years, a lot of those things for him have become system 1 type thinking. He's not having to think deliberately about what gear to be in. It's just happening. It's second nature to him. So I think one way of looking at this is to see it as kind of a learning process. So you're asking if we can train additional cognitive load. I think there's no clear answer on that, but I kind of think part of it is yes, because as we learn how to do things and we get better at them, we move from that system 2 really deliberate thinking over into something that's system 1, and it becomes more second nature to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What you just said, Amber, is going to be Cape Epic, the system 2 versus 1, where
Yes.
Brandon, you and I and Chad, we're on that system 2,
Yep.
where, and the less that we can use that, the better. Where John, it would just be like, especially because it's not very technical, especially for John, he would just be coasting the whole time
Exactly.
and not worry about it. Another interesting thing is John, he's such a good mountain biker, and he attributes to doing motocross, where everything is super fast. So when you have to go super fast and then slow it down, you don't even have to like think, right, John? It just happens.
Yeah, mountain biking still feels like slow motion, relatively speaking. It's like everything is just happening in a very organized and peaceful, easy manner. Like it never feels out of control in that regard.
For me, it's violent and scary.
Yeah, totally. It just shows that the more time you spend, like you said, Amber, even though we don't have like studies on this, it certainly seems as if, if professionals were better at doing that sort of test and got better results, it seems as if they're more accustomed to enduring circumstances like that, or more enabled. One of the two, or probably both,
Or
right? Not just
combination of both. Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
if you think about it, that's what they do every day. Every time they go out and do interval training, it's response inhibition, and they're training themselves to get better at that. So if you look at all of this as a learning process, it's like learning to read. Like you can't skip steps in the learning process, but you can accelerate the learning process if you're being really intentional and focused and taking the time to learn from what it is that you're doing. And I think Chad had some good points on this one.
I absolutely do want to talk to that, because I want to pay due credit to how hard it is to basically bring that system 1 up to speed or put it into place. You can't just practice something. I despise the term practice makes perfect, because it clearly does not. Perfect practice has the potential to make perfect. Deliberate practice, I think, is the term that's more favorable or used more often, in that we have to very consciously practice what it is we want to get better at, not just the act of it, but the perfect act of it, or as close as we can bring ourselves to perfection. We want to do this thing exceptionally well, because that's the only way we're going to get exceptionally good at it. And that's the only way we're going to entrain it to the point where it becomes a system 1 response. So a different way of putting this is that high levels of any learned skill, and it doesn't matter whether it's psychological or neurological or physical, require more than rote repetition. You can't just do a thing again and again and expect to get better. You have to do that thing really well again and again, and you will get better. So you can practice and really just insert any skill. If you do it poorly, you go nowhere. Learning to turn if you turn poorly on, say, loose over hard on a surface, if you're trying to learn proper bike body separation, if you're trying to influence your running stride, all these things have to be practiced in a very deliberate manner. It's absolutely necessary that you focus on the productive elements of whatever that challenge is, if unachievably, but if perfection is the goal.
I think a key with this is taking time to practice something where the circumstances or the consequences are lower and lower risk, and then focusing on the mechanical pieces that make it work, and reps, making sure that, at least in my experience, like my whole life growing up, my dad has always been a technician. Like everything is about technique. And if your technique is good, and you can commit that to basically, once again, transferring from those systems, if you could make sure that that technique is so ingrained in you that it becomes an automatic response or an automatic behavior, then in that scenario, then once you get into different circumstances with high risks, anything else like that, you're more likely to be doing the right thing. And that's why simple things like parking lot drills before a cyclocross race or a mountain bike race, or when you're learning mountain bike skills, going to something like a pump track rather than just going out onto the trail and practicing it on the scariest thing. Or instead of just wondering why every year at this specific race that's really tricky, you end up not performing well, making sure that you're putting yourself in circumstances that are similar to that, but at least more manageable more regularly leading up to it. It's just like going into Cape Epic. That's one big disadvantage for Brandon, in the sense that Brandon doesn't have a lot of race starts for mountain biking, right? Or really complex ones. Whereas, and Nate, I know that you do have cross-country mountain bike race starts. So you're used to that really intense nature of when things kick off. And so you're not as elevated in that state. You're not going to be as dominated by that environment. So it's totally something that I think stopping and going to basics and working on fundamentals in safe circumstances pays off big time.
And it's kind of a drag because the learning process is not sexy. But if you do it, if you subject yourself to it and you get good at it, the outcome often is something that's very appealing, something you can be proud of. But you have to work hard to cultivate it. And in the process, I mean, my fiance and I just went out to that, what's it called? Summit View or that? Oh yeah.
The bike park, Sierra Vista Bike Park. Yeah.
Sierra Vista. That's it. I was close. Yeah. Anyway, and it's flat and fast. I mean, it's got some flowy little areas, but a lot of the turns are loose over hard. And Emmett was terrified. And I said, this is skill acquisition. This is not the fun part. But what you gain from this will make everything you do subsequently so much more fun.
Right. I thought you were going to say, just send it.
No, that's what I would tell you, not her.
Well, I want to follow up on one of the things that Chad says. Again, like deliberate practice, and it's if you're just doing the same thing poorly over and over again, you're just going to ingrain a bad habit. But that doesn't mean that you have to start out doing it well. The point is, when you start out and you're not getting it quite right, to stop, like take the time, as Jonathan's saying, in an environment where you can be reflective and say, so that's the difference between just doing a bunch of mountain bike rides versus going out and sessioning a rock garden. You go through the rock garden once, you did a terrible job. Okay, what happened? What's one thing that you can get better the next time? You do that again, and you start to learn the sensations of, okay, this is how it's supposed to feel. But just know that, you don't have to get right off the bat. It's going to be terrible when you start. But being reflective, being willing to, be critical of your own effort, embrace the learning process, again, not going to be pretty, but the outcome will be really fulfilling.
One more thing on that. Being deliberate, it's really the feedback loop and how tight you can make that. And that's where coaches have that a lot of times. Like when Lee McCormick is there watching us, we get that really fast feedback loop. This happens in music and public speaking, so many other skills in life. When you don't have a coach there, a great way to do it is to record yourself. Either if you're playing music, just to like record, on your phone what you're doing. If you're doing public speaking, record yourself public speaking and then look back and watch it. So you got to get the reps in, but then you can critique yourself if you don't have a coach. And just like how Amber said, rock garden, imagine if you went through it 5 times, but you set your phone up and you recorded all 5 times too. And then you could kind of start to look at yourself from the outside. Because when you're in the moment and you're in that type 2 or system 2, you don't know what you're doing wrong. And if you're freaked out on a stage speaking with people, you don't realize you're saying and like 1,000 times. Or afterwards,
when you're on a
when
podcast.
You watch it, I know it's horrible. Now everyone's going to hear it because we do it sometimes.
Glad the episode's almost over.
They're going to go back. So recording, it's the feedback loop and how deliberate in that feedback loop you can do it. Where I think Chad's point at the beginning was, if you just throw a bunch at it and don't have any feedback loop improving, you're not going to get any better. But the best people, though, they seek out coaches, they put that video, they then send it to like an online thing if they don't have coaching, and then people critique them. They put themselves out there. They're not afraid of failure because that's the way they push forward. We've talked about this before. And then they try to get, how much learning can I do in the next X years? And then that puts me way above everybody else.
The last thing I would add to that, too, is to dissect successful performances and of others. That can be really helpful when we're talking about form and technique-based things. Even public speaking, find out what makes that one person that you really admire and you really, you want to be at that level of that person. Find out what makes them successful. A coach can be really helpful at pulling that out. But that doesn't mean that you just have to rely on a third party to do that. And what I'm thinking of is rock gardens, that sort of thing. If you can go to a spot where a successful rider is going through that and doing it well, it can be very helpful to film them just as you would film yourself. So then you can isolate specific things that are being done well that you can emulate. It's really helpful. Okay, we're going to do two live questions, and then we'll, because we went long on this one. But first is from Kyle.
Glucose is low.
Glucose is like, yes. First is from Kyle. He says, I'm a novice XC rider, and I'm trying to train on a sort of budget. He says, that's totally us cyclists. We say a sort of budget. I know what that means, Kyle. That means you've got, a flexible budget. You really want some parts or something. It says, due to this, I train only on feel, heart rate, and speed. Do you have any tips to help riders like me? And he says, maybe structured workouts. Totally, Kyle, sign up for TrainerRoad, and then you can use outside workouts, and they're RPE based, which is awesome. And then you can use virtual power with a really inexpensive trainer inside and a speed sensor, and it's a really good setup. And outside workouts for that is fantastic. It'll help you when you're training inside. You'll dial in what 7 out of 10 on your RPE scale feels like. And then that will allow you to then go outside and be able to execute your workouts really well. And you can get the workouts delivered to you with RPE-based prescription, which is really nice and really handy. Along the lines, I forgot something with outside workouts I need to mention. First of all, we've had a bunch of articles, and you should go to the blog, and we walk you through how to have successful outside workouts. Tons of great tips from our riders. But then also, this week, if you use the hashtag #GetFasterOutside and share a picture or a video of you doing your workout outside on Instagram, I'm going to go through and pick a winner, and we'll send you a TrainerRoad swag pack at the end of the week. So hopefully we'll get some folks, and this stuff's rare.
Do they get the mug?
Yeah, we'll give them a Yeti mug, which is going to be pretty exciting.
Because these are very rare.
Very rare.
Normally just podcast guests.
Yeah, so pretty exciting stuff. So I'll send you a swag pack if you use the hashtag #GetFasterOutside. Just take a video or photo of you doing your outside workout, prepping for your outside workout, whatever it is, melting from your outside workout when it's really hard, whatever it might be. Put it up there, and we'll pick somebody to share it. Okay, last question. I'm wondering if I should bump my FTP up mid-training block. I did a 1,000 TSS week last week and did just fine. Wow, that's a lot.
Wow.
This week's 108% VO2 I did at 120% just fine. And my 90-minute sweet spot I did at 95% just fine. How big of a bump? So, and then a follow-up thing. I don't want to do a full retest mid-block, but I'm not sure what percentage would be a good stopgap. So, first of all, the ramp test, I feel like you don't have to worry about it being some sort of detrimental thing. Chad, you're nodding your head. You're on the same page.
Yeah, having done some ramp tests recently, because prior to that, I hadn't touched the thing except when we were developing it. I feel like it's something I could throw in anytime, and it's pretty cut and dry. You see exactly what has happened to your threshold, and geez, was it take a 20-minute commitment, and really only 3, 4, 5 minutes of those 20 minutes are uncomfortable and might impact your next workout.
Yeah, and I haven't found them to impact. Yeah, I haven't found it to impact. Yeah,
he says, I don't want to do a full retest, and I'm thinking, it's only about 20 minutes.
Yeah, just hop on for 20 minutes and you'll know.
It is really, really hard, but you recover super fast from it. It doesn't end up being a big load at all.
That was one of the intents with the ramp test, was to make it so that you wouldn't have to do a full retest, right? Because it's not a big ordeal. We wanted to make it so that it was something that was easy that you could do if you do have this sort of question. If you do want to bump up the intensity, that is an approach you can take. But since the ramp test has such low consequence on the outside work, or on the workouts that you have outside of that moment, right, in the following days or whatever else, it's really tough to justify just going blind when you could actually get an exact measure of where you're at. So if you do bump it up, it's something where if you're bumping up every workout 5% and above, then it's time to take the ramp test. If you're bumping it up and every once in a while it's 2%, but then the next day you can't, then maybe take the ramp test just to solve the curiosity because there's low cost. But chances are it's probably not a good strategy just to continue to ramp up the intensity manually and go through that process.
Yeah, you can spare yourself that whole trial and error process by dedicating 20 minutes to a ramp test.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of circling back on cognitive load, when you're in the middle of your workout and you're wondering, is this accurate? Should I bump it up more? Should I do all that? Why not get rid of that, right? Why not just dedicate the precious resources to actually getting faster? So cool. That covers it for this week. Thanks everybody for submitting questions to the podcast. You can submit them once again at trainerroad.com/podcast. Please subscribe to the Successful Athletes podcast and share that with other people. We have new episodes coming out every week and they're fantastic. We have some great ones coming up. And also check out TrainerRoad if you want to become a faster cyclist. We will talk to you all next week. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.